Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most shocking secrets. Picture this, a world where showing your ankle could destroy your reputation forever, where a glimpse of your foot through a carriage door could make you the scandal of the entire town, where women literally died rather than reveal what we consider the most innocent part of our body today. This isn't some distant fairy tale. This was reality for millions of Victorian women. And what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about the good old days. You know, before we dive into this incredible story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring tonight. I'm always curious, where are you watching from right now? Maybe you're cozy in bed, or perhaps you're winding down after a long day. Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your stories always inspire the tales I choose to tell. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a gentle fan or some soft background noise, and let's step back in time together to uncover one of history's most bizarre obsessions. London, 1847. Lady Margaret Whitmore steps carefully from her carriage, her floor-length burgundy dress pooling around her feet like a protective shield. But as she lifts her hem just slightly, just enough to avoid the muddy street, disaster strikes. A gust of wind catches her skirt, revealing not just her ankle, but the shocking sight of her delicate leather boot. The gentleman nearby gasps audibly. The street vendor stops mid-call. Even the horses seem to pause. Why? Because Margaret has just committed what Victorian society considered a grave moral offence. You might be laughing right now, thinking this sounds ridiculous. But for Margaret, this moment would haunt her for months. Word would spread through London's social circles faster than wildfire. She'd be whispered about at tea parties, excluded from certain gatherings, and her marriage prospects, if she had been unmarried, would have plummeted overnight, all because of an ankle. This wasn't just vanity or modesty taken to extremes. The Victorian obsession with concealing women's feet and ankles was a carefully constructed system of control that went far deeper than fashion. It was about power, economics, and a society's desperate attempt to maintain order in rapidly changing times. Let me paint you a picture of just how intense this obsession was. Victorian women's dresses didn't just cover their ankles, they swept the ground. We're talking about skirts that were often 12 to 15 ft in circumference at the hem. These weren't just big dresses, they were architectural marvels designed to create an impenetrable fortress around a woman's lower body. The average Victorian lady's dress contained enough fabric to make 3 modern wedding gowns. But here's where it gets really fascinating and a little heartbreaking. These massive skirts weren't just inconvenient, they were genuinely dangerous. Women regularly caught fire from getting too close to fireplaces. They fell downstairs because they couldn't see their feet. They got caught in carriage doors and dragged through streets. There are documented cases of women drowning because their heavy waterlogged skirts pulled them under when they accidentally fell into rivers or ponds. Yet society deemed these risks acceptable, even necessary to maintain the sacred principle that a lady's ankle must never be seen. The irony is almost comical when you think about it. These same women could display their shoulders and décolletage at evening events. They could dance intimately with men, their bodies pressed close during waltzes, but show an ankle absolutely scandalous. Dr. Sarah Richardson, a Victorian social historian, uncovered some truly mind-blowing statistics in her research. She found that the average middle-class Victorian woman owned between 15 and 20 pairs of boots and shoes that no one, not even her husband, was supposed to see her wearing. These weren't practical footwear choices either. Many Victorian women's boots had heels so high and narrow that walking any significant distance was nearly impossible. But remember, they weren't meant to walk far anyway. The ideal Victorian lady was essentially a beautiful, immobile ornament. The economics behind this ankle obsession were staggering. The Victorian fashion industry built entire empires on keeping women's feet hidden. Boot manufacturers created increasingly elaborate designs with dozens of tiny buttons, intricate lacing systems, and expensive materials like kid leather and silk linings. A single pair of fashionable ladies' boots could cost the equivalent of $800 in today's money. And remember, these were shoes that were never supposed to be seen. But perhaps the most shocking part of this story isn't the rules themselves. It's how creative and rebellious some women became in response to them. Some Victorian ladies developed an entire underground culture around shoes. They'd meet secretly to show off their latest footwear acquisitions. They'd commission bootmakers to create increasingly daring designs. Boots with hidden pockets for love letters, shoes with secret compartments for small treasures. Even boots with built-in perfume reservoirs that would release subtle scents as they walked. One particularly bold London socialite, whose identity historians still protect out of respect for her descendants, reportedly owned over 200 pairs of boots and shoes. She kept detailed journals describing each pair, their occasions, and the small acts of rebellion they represented. Her entries read like love letters to freedom. Today, I wore the emerald green boots with pearl buttons. No one saw them beneath my dress, but I felt magnificent knowing they were there. The medical consequences of this obsession were severe and long-lasting. Victorian doctors, predominantly male of course, actually supported the ankle-hiding mandate by claiming that women's feet were inherently weak and needed constant protection. They argued that exposing feet to air and light would cause hysteria, infertility, and moral corruption. These weren't fringe theories. They were mainstream medical opinions published in respected journals. But here's what those doctors didn't mention, or perhaps didn't care about. The hidden epidemic of foot deformities, infected toenails, and circulation problems that plagued Victorian women. Many developed what we now know as severe bunions and hammer toes from wearing improperly fitted boots that they could never properly try on or adjust because even the fitting process was considered somewhat improper. The most heartbreaking part, many Victorian women never saw their own feet in proper light. They dressed and undressed in near darkness, using servants or family members to help with their elaborate boot fastenings. Some went their entire adult lives without ever really looking at or caring for their own feet. Imagine living so disconnected from your own body that you can't even see or touch your own feet without shame. This ankle taboo created some genuinely bizarre social situations. There are documented cases of women fainting not from tight corsets, though those certainly didn't help, but from the sheer anxiety of potentially exposing an ankle in public. Wedding nights became traumatic experiences for some brides who had never seen their own feet, let alone shown them to another person. The really twisted part is how this obsession trickled down through social classes. Working-class women who obviously couldn't afford 15-oot dress circumferences and needed to actually use their feet for labor were constantly shamed for their more practical clothing choices. They were seen as morally inferior simply because their economic reality made ankle hiding impractical. Yet even these working women found ways to participate in the ankle obsession. They'd save money for months to buy one pair of Sunday boots that they'd wear only to church, keeping them hidden under slightly longer skirts than their work clothes allowed. It was a small act of dignity in a world that constantly told them they were less worthy of respect. As we prepare to explore more of these incredible Victorian rules, I can't help but wonder about the women who lived through this. Think about the small daily humiliations, the constant awareness of your body as something shameful, the energy spent managing fabric and appearances instead of pursuing interests or dreams. And yet somehow, these same women raised families, ran households, and even began the early fights for women's rights, all while navigating a world that wouldn't let them show their ankles. The ankle obsession was just the beginning of Victorian society's attempt to control women's bodies and minds. But as we'll discover in our next chapter, Victorian women had their own ways of fighting back. And some of their methods were absolutely ingenious. We're about to meet the women who turned the simple act of fainting into a powerful weapon of communication and control. Because when society tries to make you powerless, sometimes the most radical act is to embrace that apparent weakness and use it to your advantage. Picture yourself collapsing dramatically onto a velvet sofa, the back of your hand pressed delicately against your forehead, your breathing shallow and labored. The room erupts in concerned whispers as smelling salts are frantically retrieved and worried faces hover above you. But here's the secret that would shock those Victorian gentlemen rushing to your aid. You're not actually unconscious. You're communicating. Welcome to the fascinating world of strategic swooning, where Victorian women turn society's expectation of female weakness into their most powerful tool of influence and control. Now, I know what you're thinking. Come on. Victorian women didn't really weaponize fainting, did they? Oh, but they absolutely did. And the evidence is so compelling, so cleverly documented in their own letters and diaries, that it reads like a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as delicate femininity. Let me introduce you to Miss Charlotte Bronte. Yes, the famous author, but not in the way you might expect. In 1849, Charlotte wrote to her friend Ellen Nucci, describing what she called the art of the strategic swoon. She wasn't talking about genuine medical episodes. She was describing a calculated performance that could get a woman out of an unwanted conversation, avoid an unpleasant social obligation, or even influence important family decisions. Charlotte wrote, "I have observed that a well-timed feint can accomplish what hours of rational argument cannot. When Papa grows too insistent about my marriage prospects, a gentle collapse sends him into such worried distraction that he forgets his pressures entirely." But before we dive deeper into this incredible strategy, let's talk about why fainting became so associated with Victorian women in the first place. And this is where the story gets both tragic and infuriating. The tight-lacing corset epidemic of the Victorian era was real, and it was devastating. Women were literally suffocating themselves for fashion. Dr. Arabella Keneally, one of the first female physicians in Britain, documented case after case of young women suffering from what she termed corset-induced syncope. Medical fainting caused by restricted breathing and compressed internal organs. The average Victorian corset, when properly tightened, reduced a woman's waist by 4 to 7 in. Imagine wrapping a tight belt around your ribcage and then trying to breathe normally. Now imagine doing that every single day from the age of 13 until you died. Many women developed what doctors called corset liver. Their organs were literally reshaped by the constant pressure, but here's where Victorian women's ingenuity shines through. They realized that society's expectation of female fragility, partly caused by these ridiculous fashion demands, could actually work in their favor. If everyone expected you to be weak and prone to collapse, then strategic weakness became a form of power. Lady Caroline Lamb, one of the most notorious figures of her time, perfected what her contemporaries called the calculated vapors. Her personal maid, writing in her secret diary years later, revealed that Caroline had developed an entire repertoire of different feints for different occasions. There was the gentle decline for avoiding tedious social calls, the dramatic swoon for stopping arguments, and what the maid called the emergency collapse. Reserved for moments when Caroline needed to create such a distraction that everyone forgot what they were discussing entirely. Caroline's technique was so convincing that even her own husband often fell for it. The maid wrote, "Her ladyship could regulate her breathing and pulse so skillfully that even the family physician was occasionally fooled. She once maintained a delicate state for 3 entire days to avoid attending a political dinner where she knew her opinions would not be welcome. The medical establishment of the time, dominated entirely by men, actually supported this narrative of female fragility. Dr. Edward Clark, a Harvard medical professor, published widely read papers claiming that women's reproductive organs made them inherently unstable and prone to nervous collapse. These weren't fringe theories. They were mainstream medical opinion that gave Victorian women the perfect cover for their strategic performances. But the most fascinating part isn't just that women fainted strategically. It's how they communicated through their fainting. Different types of swoons carried different messages that other women could read like a secret code. Mrs. Isabella Beeton, famous for her household management books, included in her private correspondence what she called the language of vapors. A sudden collapse during a social gathering meant, "Rescue me from this conversation." A gradual decline with dramatic breathing meant, "I strongly disagree with what's being discussed." And a complete swoon that required carrying to another room meant, "This situation is completely unacceptable and must end immediately." The beauty of this system was its plausible deniability. A woman could express the strongest possible disagreement with her father's business decisions or her husband's social plans. And when she recovered, everyone would focus on her health rather than questioning her opinions. It was brilliant. Some women took this art form to incredible extremes. There are documented cases of women who could faint on command so convincingly that they fooled medical examinations. One London socialite, whose name historians still protect, reportedly used strategic fainting to delay 3 different arranged marriages until she was finally able to marry her chosen partner. The economic impact of these performances was substantial. Families would spend fortunes on medical consultations, expensive treatments, and elaborate recovery regimens for women who are often perfectly healthy. Smelling salts became such a booming industry that pharmacists couldn't keep them in stock. Fainting couches, those elegant curved sofas designed specifically for swooning, became essential furniture in every proper Victorian home. But here's the really shocking part. Some Victorian women became so skilled at controlling their breathing and heart rate for these performances that they accidentally developed what we now recognize as advanced meditation techniques. Modern researchers studying Victorian medical records have found descriptions of women who could slow their pulse, control their breathing, and enter to like states that sound remarkably similar to techniques taught by professional meditation instructors today. Dr. Patricia Vatinsky, a researcher specializing in Victorian women's health, discovered something amazing in her analysis of hundreds of Victorian medical records. She found that women who regularly suffered from vapors often lived longer and reported fewer stress-related illnesses than their contemporaries who never fainted. Her theory, these strategic fainting spells, were actually serving as pressure release valves in lives that offered very few other forms of emotional expression or control. The social rules around fainting became incredibly complex. There were proper ways to faint, proper places to faint, and proper responses to fainting. A lady never fainted in a muddy street. That would be undignified. She never fainted when it would inconvenience servants too greatly. That would be inconsiderate, and she absolutely never fainted at inappropriate moments that might reveal the calculated nature of her collapse. Young ladies received informal training in proper fainting technique from their mothers' ends. They practiced controlled breathing, learned how to fall gracefully without injury, and studied the art of timing their recoveries for maximum impact. It was an unofficial curriculum in female survival skills disguised as medical weakness. The international scope of this phenomenon was remarkable. American women visiting Europe wrote home about learning new fainting techniques from their European counterparts. French women developed what they called Ivanus strategic, while German women perfected the Beret UN. It was a global sisterhood of strategic swooning. But perhaps the most touching aspect of this story is what it reveals about the inner lives of Victorian women. In their private letters and diaries, many wrote about the exhaustion of constant performance, the sadness of having to fake weakness to have any influence, and the longing for a world where their genuine thoughts and feelings would be valued. As we move forward in our exploration of Victorian women's lives, remember that behind every seemingly submissive or fragile Victorian lady might have been a brilliant strategist working within impossibly restrictive rules to carve out some small space of agency and control. These women weren't victims, they were survivors, and some of their survival techniques were absolutely ingenious. But if you think strategic fainting was extreme, wait until you discover what Victorian women were willing to risk for beauty. Because coming up next, we're diving into a world where fashion literally killed, where being beautiful meant accepting genuine danger, and where women knowingly poisoned themselves daily in the name of looking proper. The lengths these women went to for society's approval will leave you speechless. What if I told you that Victorian women were literally glowing in the dark? Not in some magical romantic way, but because they were slowly dying from arsenic poisoning, one beautiful green dress at a time. The year was 1862, and 19-year-old Matilda Schurer was the envy of every young woman in London. She worked in a prestigious artificial flower factory, creating the most coveted fashion accessories of the era. Brilliant emerald green flowers that adorned the hair and dresses of society's elite. Matilda's hands were stained a beautiful luminous green that seemed to shimmer in candlelight. Her fingernails had taken on an otherworldly glow. She was quite literally a living work of art. She was also dying. What Matilda and thousands of women like her didn't know was that they were handling pure arsenic every single day. That gorgeous, sought-after green colour that made Victorian fashion so stunning. It was created with Shields green and Paris green, pigments that contained more arsenic than rat poison. Matilda began experiencing what doctors politely called industrial fatigue. Her skin started peeling. Her hair fell out in clumps. She vomited green bile and developed ulcers that wouldn't heal. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Matilda died in agony, her body literally poisoned by beauty. But here's the truly shocking part. Even after cases like Matilda's became public knowledge, Victorian society didn't stop using these deadly pigments. They simply couldn't give up being beautiful. Even if beauty meant death, the Victorian obsession with toxic fashion went far beyond arsenic green, though that was certainly the most dramatic killer. Let me paint you a picture of what getting dressed meant for a fashionable Victorian woman. It was essentially a daily game of chemical Russian roulette. Their face powder contained lead that would slowly accumulate in their bodies, causing what doctors euphemistically called painter's colic, severe abdominal pain, kidney failure, and eventual death. The rouge on their cheeks was made with vermilion, a mercury compound that caused tremors, tooth loss, and neurological damage. Even their lipstick contained mercury, lead, and sometimes traces of arsenic for that perfect natural pink hue. But women didn't just wear these toxins, they consumed them. Victorian beauty manuals recommended eating chalk and drinking vinegar to achieve a pale, ethereal complexion. They took arsenic tablets as beauty supplements, believing small doses would give them clear skin and bright eyes. Some women ate cotton balls to suppress their appetite and achieve the coveted consumptive chic look. That thin, pale, seemingly fragile appearance that was considered the height of beauty. Dr. Andrew Winter, writing in the medical journal The Lancet in 1862, documented case after case of what he termed fashion fatalities. He wrote, "I have seen more young women killed by their wardrobes than by any disease. They are literally dressed to death." The most heartbreaking part. These women often knew they were taking risks. Letters and diaries from the period reveal that many Victorian women understood their cosmetics and clothing were dangerous. but they felt they had no choice. In a society where a woman's appearance determined her marriage prospects, social status, and even basic survival, looking beautiful wasn't vanity. It was economic necessity. Mrs. Sarah Ellis, a popular advice writer of the era, captured this tragic reality in her 1845 guide for young women. A lady must be beautiful, or she must appear beautiful, regardless of the cost to her health or purse. For what is life without the admiration of society? The fashion industry, of course, knew exactly how dangerous their products were. Internal documents from major fashion houses, discovered by historians in recent decades, reveal that manufacturers were well aware of the health risks, but the profits were simply too enormous to give up. A single arsenic green ball gown could cost the equivalent of $15,000 in today's money. The artificial flower industry alone employed over 50,000 women in London, all handling deadly materials daily. Some of the stories are almost too shocking to believe. There was the case of Lady Margaret Marsh, who wore an arsenic green ball gown to 3 different social events in 1863. After the 3rd wearing, she developed severe skin lesions where the dress had touched her body. Her physician, Dr. Thomas Houghton, documented that the dress had literally burned through her skin in several places. Yet, Lady Margaret's main concern wasn't her health. It was whether the dress could be altered to hide the damaged areas so she could continue wearing it. The mercury-based cosmetics created their own special horrors. Women who used them regularly developed what was known as hatter's disease, the same condition that affected hat makers who used mercury in their work. They experienced mood swings, memory loss, and violent tremors. Some became so erratic that their families had them committed to asylums, never realizing that their beloved face powder was slowly driving them insane. One of the most documented cases involves Miss Clara R. Morrison, a young woman from a prominent Manchester family. Her diary, preserved in the Manchester Historical Society, chronicles her gradual descent into mercury poisoning over 2 years. She wrote, "My hands shake so terribly now that I can barely hold my pen, yet I cannot abandon my daily beauty routine. How else am I to catch a suitable husband?" Clara's final entries, written in barely legible script, describe hallucinations and paranoia. She died at age 23. Her body found surrounded by dozens of bottles of mercury-laced cosmetics that she had hidden around her room like treasures. The international scope of this toxic beauty epidemic was staggering. French women were dying from lead-based face paints. German women suffered from copper-green dress poisoning. American women imported European cosmetics specifically because they were more dangerous and therefore more effective at creating that pale, ethereal look that suggested delicate health. The really twisted irony is that the symptoms of slow poisoning were often considered attractive. The pale skin and red lips caused by lead poisoning were seen as signs of natural beauty. The trembling hands from mercury exposure were interpreted as evidence of feminine sensitivity. The weight loss from arsenic consumption was praised as fashionable thinness. Dr. Elena Rathbone, one of the first women to study occupational health hazards, spent years documenting what she called the beauty plague. Her 1878 research revealed that the average life expectancy of women working in cosmetics and fashion manufacturing was just 28 years. Even wealthy women who only wore these items occasionally had significantly higher rates of organ failure, neurological disorders, and mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came from analyzing Victorian cemetery records. Researchers found that women buried in their finest clothing, those arsenic-green dresses and mercury-laden accessories, continued to poison the soil around their graves for decades after their deaths. Some Victorian cemeteries had to be treated as hazardous waste sites over a century later. The beauty industry developed increasingly creative ways to market death. They created safe arsenic complexes that were supposedly less dangerous. They invented lead-free face powders that simply used different toxic metals. They promoted natural cosmetics that contained plant-based poisons instead of mineral ones. Women were dying, but at least they were dying naturally. Some women did try to resist. There were small movements promoting natural beauty, but even these often involved dangerous practices like bloodletting to achieve pale skin or eating poisonous berries to re-in lips naturally. The very concept of safe beauty seemed impossible in Victorian society. The saddest part of this story isn't just that women died for beauty, it's that they had to choose between being beautiful and being alive. And many felt they couldn't choose life. In a world where an unmarried woman had virtually no economic options, where social acceptance meant survival, the choice between poison and poverty wasn't really a choice at all. As we continue exploring the hidden costs of Victorian femininity, remember that every time you see a romantic period film with all those gorgeous green gowns and porcelain pale complexions, you're looking at a world where beauty literally killed. These women weren't vain. They were trapped in a system that valued their appearance over their lives. But if deadly fashion seems extreme, wait until you discover the secret language that Victorian women developed to communicate right under society's nose. Because when you can't speak freely, you find other ways to have conversations, and the tool they chose will absolutely amaze you. Imagine sitting in a Victorian parlour, watching what appears to be an innocent young lady delicately fanning herself during polite conversation. But if you knew how to read the secret signals, you'd realize you were witnessing something far more scandalous than casual chit-chat. That seemingly innocent fan was actually conducting an elaborate forbidden love affair right in front of her parents' eyes. The fan held against her left cheek meant, "I wish to get rid of you." Touching the fan to her lips, whispered, "Kiss me." Carrying it in her left hand, declared, "I wish to become acquainted," while holding it over her heart, screamed, "You have won my love." And when she snapped that fan shut, she was saying, "I wish to speak with you." A message that could launch 1,000 secret rendezvous. Welcome to the most sophisticated communication system ever created by women under oppression. The language of fans. And what I'm about to tell you about this secret code will blow your mind. By 1850, Victorian society had created such strict rules about when, where and how unmarried people could speak to each other that young women essentially lived in a state of enforced silence. A lady could not initiate conversation with a gentleman without a formal introduction. She couldn't express romantic interest directly. She couldn't even indicate preferences about her own future without being considered forward or improper. But Victorian women were far too clever to accept this enforced silence. So they created their own language, one that could be conducted in full view of the most watchful chaperone, understood by the intended recipient, yet remained completely invisible to disapproving parents and society guardians. The fan language system was so sophisticated that it had regional dialects, generational variations, and even class-specific modifications. What a working-class girl meant by placing her fan behind her head was different from what the same gesture meant among aristocratic ladies. It was like having different programming languages for different social networks. Let me share one of the most remarkable documented cases of fan communication from the personal papers of Miss Emily Hartwell, preserved in the Hartwell family archives. Emily was a 20-year-old from a prominent Boston family who fell in love with James Morrison, a young man her parents deemed unsuitable due to his modest income as a schoolteacher. For 8 months, Emily and James conducted their entire courtship through fan signals at social gatherings, never speaking directly to each other more than polite pleasantries. Emily's diary, written in a code she developed herself, documents their elaborate fan conversations in stunning detail. She wrote, "Tonight at the Weatherby's musical evening, I informed James of my feelings through the sacred language. When I placed my fan against my right cheek, he understood that I desired to speak with him privately. His slight nod toward the garden door, combined with my fan pressed to my lips, arranged our meeting for tomorrow's church service. But here's where it gets really fascinating and a little dangerous. Emily and James developed their own private modifications to the standard fan language, creating what amounted to their own lover's dialect. They assigned specific meanings to the speed of fan movements, the angle at which it was held, even which fingers were used to grip the handle. Emily documented over 60 different signals they used, including fan, held in right hand, in front of face, meant follow me. Fan placed on left ear meant I wish to get rid of you. Useful for discouraging other suitors, and their most daring signal, fan shut and resting on right cheek, meant yes, which Emily used to accept James's fan-communicated marriage proposal during a crowded dinner party with her parents sitting just 3 FT away. The complexity of this communication system rivaled any modern coding language. Mrs. Isabella Stewart's 1847 guide, The Lady's Companion to Graceful Communication, documented over 200 distinct fan signals that were considered part of basic female education. Young ladies spent months learning proper fan technique, not just for the movements themselves, but for the precise timing, positioning, and contextual usage that made the language effective. The economic impact of fan communication was enormous. The fan industry exploded during the Victorian era, not just because fans were fashionable accessories, but because they were essential communication tools. Wealthy families would commission custom fans with specific decorative elements that added additional layers of meaning to the basic gesture language. One London fan maker, Charles Duvernoy, kept detailed records of custom orders that revealed just how seriously families took fan communication. His 1863 order book shows requests for fans with conversation diamonds, tiny gemstones placed at specific points on the fan that would catch light when held at particular angles, adding visual emphasis to spoken messages. But the fan language wasn't just for romantic communication. Women used it for all sorts of forbidden conversations, political opinions, business observations, social criticism, even family gossip. Anything that women weren't supposed to discuss openly could be communicated through carefully choreographed fan movements. Mrs. Margaret Fuller, the famous transcendentalist writer, documented in her private letters how women at political gatherings used fan signals to share their real opinions about candidates and policies. She wrote, "While the gentlemen debate the merits of various political positions, we ladies conduct our own political discourse through the silent eloquence of painted silk and ivory." The international variations were remarkable. Spanish women developed what they called lingua de l'abanico, which included specific signals for religious and family matters that weren't part of the English system. French ladies created langue de leonte, which incorporated dance-like movements that could be read from across large ballrooms. Italian women developed the most dramatic version, with sweeping gestures that could communicate complex emotional states and family relationships. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of fan language was how women taught it to each other. Since this knowledge couldn't be passed down through official channels, imagine asking your mother to teach you how to flirt behind her back. Women created an underground educational network. Older married women who had more social freedom would discreetly mentor younger unmarried ladies. They'd meet for fan practice sessions disguised as casual social calls. Some wealthy families even hired governor figures specifically to teach proper fan technique. Though this was never officially acknowledged, the learning process was incredibly sophisticated. Advanced practitioners could conduct conversations while maintaining perfect social composure. never breaking character as demure, obedient daughters. They developed peripheral vision techniques to read fan signals without appearing to stare. They learned to interpret messages through brief glances that wouldn't attract attention. Miss Caroline Thompson's correspondence with her sister reveals the intense preparation that went into mastering fan communication. She wrote, "I practice daily before my mirror, ensuring that my yes signal cannot be confused with my perhaps gesture." The difference of two in fan placement could change the entire meaning of a conversation. The psychological effects of this secret communication system were profound. Women who mastered fan language reported feeling more confident, more intellectually engaged, and more connected to other women. It created a sense of sisterhood among practitioners. They shared a secret knowledge that gave them power in a powerless situation. But the system also created incredible pressure. Women who couldn't master fan language or who misread signals could find themselves socially isolated. There are documented cases of young women suffering severe anxiety over fan communication mistakes that led to social embarrassment or missed romantic opportunities. The most touching aspect of fan language is what it reveals about the intellectual capabilities of Victorian women. This wasn't a simple system of basic signals. It was a complex, evolving language with grammar, syntax, and cultural nuances. Women who were supposedly too delicate and simple-minded for serious conversation had created a communication system that required incredible memory, spatial awareness, and social intelligence. Dr. Sarah Jane Williams, a Victorian-era physician who was one of the first to study women's health comprehensively, noted in her private research that women who used fan language showed significantly better cognitive function and social adaptation than those who remained completely passive in social situations. Some of the documented fan conversations were absolutely brilliant. There are records of women conducting complex business negotiations, arranging charity work, and even organizing early women's rights activities, all through fan signals during supposedly innocent social gatherings. As we move deeper into the hidden world of Victorian women's survival strategies, remember that every time you see a period drama with ladies gracefully wielding fans, you're watching master communicators using tools of resistance disguised as accessories of submission. But if you think fan language was complicated, wait until you hear about the social warfare that Victorian women conducted through something even more seemingly innocent. Their visiting cards, because the calling card system created battles so fierce and strategies so cunning that they make modern social media drama look like child's play. 3 small pieces of paper destroyed Mrs. Adelaide Peaton's social life forever. They weren't love letters, scandalous photographs, or evidence of any impropriety. They were calling cards, and the way she handled them in the spring of 1858 turned her from London society's darling into its most notorious outcast in less than 24 hours. You see, Adelaide made a fatal mistake. When Lady Catherine Worthington came calling, Adelaide instructed her servant to say she was not at home. Victorian code for "I don't want to see you right now." But here's where it gets deliciously complicated. Adelaide forgot that Lady Catherine could see her silhouette through the drawing room window, clearly proving she was lying. Lady Catherine left her calling card with one corner folded down, a silent declaration of war. That tiny fold communicated to anyone who understood the system that Adelaide had committed an unforgivable social sin. Within hours, the news had spread through London's elite circles like wildfire. By evening, Adelaide's silver card tray, once overflowing with invitations, sat empty. She'd been socially executed by a piece of paper. Welcome to the Victorian calling card system, the most ruthlessly efficient social media platform ever created, where your reputation could be built or destroyed with the flick of a wrist, and the strategic placement of cardboard. Now, if you think modern social media is dramatic, you clearly haven't studied the Victorian calling card wars. These weren't just polite social customs. They were weapons of mass social destruction wielded by women who turned etiquette into an art form of psychological warfare. The calling card system operated on rules so complex they required dedicated instruction manuals. Mrs. John Sherwood's 1884 guide, Manners and Social Usages, contained over 40 pages devoted entirely to calling card protocols, and these weren't suggestions. They were laws, as rigid as any legal code, with violations punished by complete social exile. Let me walk you through the basic battlefield. Every proper Victorian lady had multiple sets of calling cards. There were formal cards for official visits, smaller cards for intimate friends, mourning cards with black borders, and special cards for different seasons. The paper quality, font choice, and even the card's thickness communicated your social status before you ever said a word. But the real genius and danger lay in how these cards were used. The way you folded a card, where you placed it, which corner you turned down, even how you presented it to the servant could send dozens of different messages. It was like having a complex coding system that everyone in society was expected to master perfectly. Mrs. Emily Post's grandmother, Mrs. Josephine Post, kept detailed records of her calling card interactions that read like military intelligence reports. In her 1862 diary, she documented what she called the Battle of Beacon Hill, where 3 prominent Boston families destroyed each other's reputations through a series of increasingly aggressive calling card maneuvers. It started when Mrs. Harrison left cards for both Mrs. Catt and Mrs. Lodge on the same afternoon, but used different qualities of cardstock, signaling that she considered one family superior to the other. Mrs. Lodge, insulting detected, retaliated by leaving her card at Mrs. Harrison's house with the upper right corner folded down, indicating she had called personally but found no one worthy of receiving her at home. Mrs. Catt, not to be outdone, sent her least impressive servant to deliver her card to Mrs. Lodge, communicating that she considered the Lodge family beneath her personal attention. The war escalated until all 3 families were essentially banned from proper Boston society for what contemporary observers called ungenteel card combat. But here's what makes this system absolutely fascinating. Women developed incredibly sophisticated strategies for using these seemingly innocent pieces of paper to control their social environments. They could exclude rivals, promote favorites, signal alliances, and even conduct business negotiations. All through the strategic deployment of calling cards, Miss Constance Whitney, whose correspondence is preserved in the Whitney family papers at Yale, described her calling card strategy with the precision of a military campaign. She wrote to her sister, "I am carefully orchestrating my Thursday afternoon calls to ensure that Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Davidson both see my card at Mrs. Richardson's, but neither sees evidence of my visit to the other. This will create the impression that I favor Mrs. Richardson above both, which should secure my invitation to the Newport Cottage party." The psychological sophistication required to navigate this system was extraordinary. Women had to track dozens of social relationships simultaneously, remember complex rules that varied by situation, and execute split-second strategic decisions that could have lasting consequences. The economic impact was staggering. Families spent enormous sums on calling card accessories. There were special card cases, silver trays for receiving cards, elaborate calling card albums for displaying important connections, and even furniture designed specifically for card-related activities. The calling card industry employed thousands of engravers, printers, and designers who catered to increasingly elaborate demands. One London stationer, Frederick Warr and Company, kept records showing that wealthy families spent the equivalent of $5,000 annually in today's money just on calling cards and related accessories. They offered cards with gold embossing, hand-painted illustrations, and even cards embedded with real flowers or fabric samples. But the most ruthless aspect of the calling card system was how it was used to enforce social hierarchies. Women could effectively blacklist entire families by coordinating their calling patterns. If the influential ladies of a community decided someone was unworthy, they could orchestrate a campaign of social exclusion that was devastating in its completeness. Mrs. Ward Mallister, the self-appointed social arbiter of New York's Gilded Age, perfected what historians calling card assassination. Her technique involved creating elaborate scenarios where targeted individuals would unknowingly violate calling card protocols, then ensuring their mistakes became public knowledge. She could destroy someone's social standing while maintaining the appearance of perfect propriety herself. One of her most famous victims was Mrs. Rebecca Hartwell, a wealthy widow who made the mistake of trying to enter New York society without Mallister's approval. Mallister orchestrated a situation where Mrs. Hartwell was invited to several conflicting social events on the same day, making it impossible for her to leave calling cards appropriately for all hostesses. When Mrs. Hartwell chose to attend the event she thought most important, the snubbed hostesses interpreted her absence as a personal insult. Mallister then ensured that news of Mrs. Hartwell's rudeness spread through society quickly. Within a month, Mrs. Hartwell found herself completely excluded from social invitations. She eventually left New York entirely, defeated by pieces of paper. The international variations in calling card systems created additional opportunities for social disaster. American women visiting Europe regularly committed calling card errors that marked them as provincial. European ladies traveling to America often found their sophisticated continental protocols misinterpreted as snobbishness. Miss Alice James, sister of the famous William and Henry James, documented these cultural calling card collisions in her letters from Europe. She wrote, "I have witnessed 3 separate social catastrophes this month, all caused by well-meaning ladies who applied their home country's calling card rules in foreign territory. One poor American woman was completely ostracized from Parisian society because she didn't understand that leaving cards on Sunday was considered vulgar here, though perfectly acceptable in Boston. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the calling card system was how it created a shadow economy run entirely by women. Since ladies couldn't engage in traditional business, they used calling card networks to organize investment groups, charitable foundations, and even early feminist organizations. Mrs. Lucretia Mott used calling card networks to organize the women's rights movement. She developed a system where specific card folding patterns indicated meeting times and locations for women interested in suffrage activities. The authorities never suspected that the Gentile ritual of leaving calling cards was being used to coordinate political resistance. The system also created an entire service industry of social intelligence. Wealthy families employed servants whose specific job was to track calling card patterns throughout their social circle. These card watchers would report on who was visiting whom, which families were rising or falling in social status, and what new alliances were forming. Some women became professional social strategists, hired discreetly by new money families who needed help navigating the calling card minefield. These social consultants charged enormous fees to coach nouveau riche families in proper card protocols and help them avoid the social landmines that could destroy their aspirations. The psychological pressure of the calling card system was immense. Women developed what doctors called card anxiety, a condition where the mere sight of their calling card tray could trigger panic attacks. The fear of making a card-related mistake that could destroy their family's social standing led some women to become virtual hermits, afraid to participate in the very social system that defined their worth. Yet despite all its dangers and complications, many women found empowerment in mastering the calling card system. It gave them a socially acceptable way to exercise influence, build networks, and shape their communities. For women who were barred from business, politics, and public life, calling cards provided a pathway to real power. As we continue exploring the hidden complexities of Victorian women's lives, remember that behind every gracious social custom was often a woman wielding it like a weapon, building alliances like a diplomat, and surviving in a world that gave her very few tools for self-determination. But if calling card warfare seems intense, prepare yourself for the most elaborate and emotionally devastating social ritual Victorian women endured: the mourning process. Because when death touched a Victorian family, it didn't just bring grief. It brought a complex set of rules that could trap a woman in elaborate performances of sorrow for years of her life. When Queen Victoria's beloved Prince Albert died in December 1861, she didn't just lose her husband. She sentenced an entire empire to 40 years of elaborate obsessive mourning rituals that would transform grief from a personal emotion into a public performance. And for Victorian women, this meant that death in the family could trap them in a prison of black fabric, social isolation, and prescribed sorrow that sometimes lasted longer than the actual marriage had. Meet Mrs. Catherine Morrison, a 32-year-old widow from Edinburgh who followed every mourning rule perfectly after her husband's death in 1863. She wore full black for 2 years and 6 months, then half-mourning grey and lavender for another year. She covered every mirror in her house, draped every piece of furniture in black cloth, and wore a thick black veil that made it difficult to see or breathe properly. She avoided social gatherings, music, and any form of entertainment. By the time her official mourning period ended in 1867, Catherine had spent nearly 4 years of her life essentially buried alive. Her health had deteriorated from lack of sunlight and social interaction. Her children barely knew her behind the veils, and perhaps most tragically, she'd actually forgotten how to experience genuine emotion. The prescribed performance of grief had replaced her natural healing process entirely. This was the reality of Victorian mourning culture, a system so elaborate and demanding that it turned death into a fashion statement and grief into a competitive performance. The mourning dress code alone was a masterpiece of complicated cruelty. A widow was expected to wear deep mourning for at least 2 years, heavy black fabrics with no shine, trim, or decoration. The dress had to cover every inch of skin, except for a small portion of the face. The sleeves were tight-fitting and uncomfortable. The skirts were so heavy, with multiple layers of black crepe, that many women developed back problems from the sheer weight of their grief costume. But here's where it gets really fascinating and disturbing. The mourning industry became one of the most profitable businesses of the Victorian era. Companies like Peter Robinson in London made fortunes by creating elaborate mourning wardrobes that could cost more than most people earned in a year. They offered complete mourning outfits that included everything from black-trimmed handkerchiefs to specially designed mourning jewelry. The jewelry alone was an industry worth millions. Victorian mourning jewelry wasn't just black. It was often made from the hair of the deceased person. Women would commission elaborate brooches, rings, and necklaces woven from their dead husband's or child's hair. They wore these hair jewelry pieces as proof of their proper devotion, creating a macabre fashion trend that literally meant wearing death as decoration. Mrs. Elena Blackwell's mourning jewelry collection, preserved in the Victoria and Albert Museum, includes over 30 pieces made from family members' hair. Her detailed inventory, written in her own hand, describes each piece. Bracelet of dear William's hair, woven with gold thread, worn daily for 18 months. Brooch containing mother's hair, surrounded by seed pearls, displayed only on anniversary of her passing. But the really shocking part wasn't just wearing mourning clothes, it was the timeline. Society had specific mourning periods for every possible family relationship, and these periods were rigidly enforced. A widow mourned for 2 years minimum. A mother mourning a child could be expected to wear black for the rest of her life. Even distant relatives required specific mourning periods. 6 months for a grandparent, 3 months for an uncle or aunt, 6 weeks for a first cousin. The social policing of these mourning rules was ruthless. Women who appeared in public too soon, wore the wrong shade of black, or seemed insufficiently sorrowful were publicly shamed. Mrs. Sarah Stickney Ellis, a popular Victorian advice writer, documented case after case of women who were socially ostracized for inadequate mourning performance. One particularly heartbreaking case involved Mrs. Margaret Sinclair, who lost her infant daughter in 1859. Margaret followed all the mourning rules perfectly for 8 months, but when she was spotted smiling while speaking to her surviving son in a park, a neighbor reported her inappropriate cheerfulness to their social circle. Margaret found herself excluded from social gatherings and church activities because she dared to show maternal love for her living child while still officially mourning her dead one. The psychological impact of these prolonged mourning requirements was devastating. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the first psychiatrists to study grief, wrote in his 1867 journal about what he called prescribed melancholia cases, where women became genuinely depressed, not from their loss, but from the social requirement to perform depression for years at a time. He documented women who couldn't stop mourning even after their official periods ended, who had become so accustomed to isolation and sorrow that they couldn't remember how to experience joy. Some women developed what he termed mourning addiction. They became dependent on the social attention and sympathy that came with being a tragic figure. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Some Victorian women found ways to use the mourning system to their advantage, because mourning gave women certain social freedoms they didn't have otherwise. Clever women sometimes used extended mourning periods to escape unwanted marriages, avoid social obligations they disliked, or pursue interests that would otherwise be considered inappropriate. Miss Caroline Hampton, whose private papers were discovered in the 1990s, documented how she used her mother's death as an opportunity for what she called socially acceptable rebellion. During her official mourning period, she was excused from the social events she found tedious, freed from expectations of marriage-seeking behavior, and able to spend her time reading and writing, activities her family had previously discouraged as too intellectual for a young lady. Caroline wrote to her friend, "I confess that beneath my genuine grief for dear mother lies a terrible secret satisfaction. In mourning, I am finally free to be myself without society's constant demands for charm and marriageability." The international mourning industry was enormous. French mourning crepe was considered the finest quality, German mourning jewelry the most elaborate, and American mourning photography the most innovative. Yes, photographing the dead became a booming business, with families commissioning elaborate portraits of deceased relatives to display in their homes. Some of these post-mortem photographs were so lifelike that visitors couldn't tell the subjects were dead. Photographers developed techniques for posing bodies to look naturally sleeping or sitting, and families would often include living relatives in these portraits, creating haunting images of families posed with their deceased members as if nothing had changed. The mourning portrait industry reveals the Victorian obsession with making death decorative. These weren't simple memorial photos. They were elaborate productions with props, staging, and careful lighting designed to create beautiful images of tragedy. Families spent fortunes on these portraits, often commissioning multiple poses and settings to create what amounted to death-themed photo albums. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of Victorian mourning culture was the mourning etiquette that governed social interactions. There were specific rules for how to speak to mourning women, what topics were appropriate, even how long you could look at someone in mourning dress. Violating these rules could result in social punishment almost as severe as inadequate mourning itself. Mrs. Isabella Beaton's household management guide included an entire chapter on proper interaction with the bereaved, which reads like a diplomatic protocol for navigating conversations with mourning women. The complexity was staggering. Different phases of mourning required different conversational approaches, different levels of sympathy, and different types of practical assistance. The economic burden of proper mourning was crushing for many families. Beyond the expensive clothing and jewelry, families were expected to drape their homes in black cloth, host elaborate funeral ceremonies, commission memorial artwork, and maintain expensive grave sites. Many families went into debt trying to mourn properly, creating financial hardship that could last for decades. Some entrepreneurs built entire business empires around mourning services. They offered mourning consultation, complete home draping services, professional mourning attendance, and even mourning vacation packages where grieving families could retreat to specially designed mourning resorts where their sorrow would be properly supported and displayed. The strangest part of all this elaborate mourning theatre was how it often prevented actual grieving. Women became so focused on performing their sorrow correctly that they never had time or space to process their actual emotions. The rigid rules and social expectations created a kind of emotional paralysis where authentic grief was replaced by scripted displays of suffering. Yet within this suffocating system, some women found unexpected strength. The mourning period gave them a socially acceptable reason to withdraw from society's demands, to focus inward, and sometimes to discover inner resources they hadn't known they possessed. Some used their mourning periods to develop artistic talents, pursue charitable work, or build female friendships that sustained them long after their black dresses were put away. As we delve deeper into the elaborate restrictions that governed Victorian women's lives, remember that behind every widow's weeds and mourning veil was a real woman trying to navigate genuine loss, while performing grief for a society that valued the appearance of sorrow more than the reality of healing. But if the mourning system seems restrictive, wait until you discover the suffocating world of chaperoning, where Victorian women could literally never be alone, where privacy was considered dangerous, and where the simple act of having an unchaperoned conversation could destroy a woman's reputation forever. Try to imagine living your entire adult life without ever being alone with another person of the opposite sex. Not for 5 minutes, not for a casual conversation, not even to ask for directions on a street corner. This was the reality for millions of Victorian women who lived under the suffocating surveillance of the chaperone system, where privacy wasn't just discouraged. It was considered morally dangerous and socially catastrophic. In 1854, 23-year-old Miss Julia Bradford made a mistake that would haunt her for the rest of her life. While attending a garden party in Philadelphia, she stepped away from her chaperone for exactly 7 minutes to retrieve a dropped glove from behind a rose bush. During those 7 minutes, she encountered Mr. Thomas Whitfield, a respectable banker's son, who gallantly helped her search for the glove. They exchanged perhaps 20 words, polite pleasantries about the weather and the beauty of the garden. No romantic words were spoken, no improper behavior occurred, but they were seen talking alone without supervision. By evening, rumors were flying through Philadelphia society about Julia's scandalous rendezvous. Within a week, her engagement to another gentleman was broken. Her family's reputation was questioned, and Julia found herself effectively unmarriageable in proper society. 7 minutes of innocent conversation destroyed her entire future, all because she had violated the sacred Victorian rule that unmarried women must never ever be alone with men. The chaperone system wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a comprehensive surveillance network that turned every social interaction into a carefully monitored performance. and the rules governing this system were so complex and demanding that they essentially turned Victorian women into prisoners of their own social class. Let me paint you a picture of what this constant supervision actually meant in daily life. A young Victorian lady could not walk down the street alone, visit a shop unaccompanied, attend a theatre performance without supervision, or even sit in her own garden if there was any possibility that a male neighbour might see her. She required a chaperone for riding in carriages, attending church services, visiting friends, and participating in any social gathering where men might be present. But here's where it gets really interesting and expensive. The chaperone industry became one of the largest employers of women in Victorian society. Wealthy families employed professional chaperones whose full-time job was surveillance. Middle-class families relied on elderly female relatives, unmarried aunts, or family friends to provide chaperoning services. Even working-class families found ways to ensure their daughters were never unsupervised in mixed company. Mrs. Emmeline Hartwell, a professional chaperone working in New York during the 1870s, kept detailed records of her duties that read like intelligence reports. Her daily logs document every conversation her charges had, every gentleman they encountered, and every potential threat to their reputations. In one typical week, she chaperoned 4 different young ladies to 17 separate social events, positioning herself strategically to overhear conversations while appearing to focus on her needlework. Mrs. Hartwell wrote in her private journal, "The art of chaperoning requires the stealth of a spy, the hearing of a bat, and the memory of an elephant. I must appear invisible while missing nothing, seem inattentive while cataloguing every interaction, and maintain perfect propriety while preventing others from losing theirs." The psychological impact of constant supervision was devastating. Young women developed what doctors called chaperone anxiety, a condition where they became incapable of normal social interaction without supervision. Some women reported feeling panic attacks when left alone, even briefly, having become so accustomed to constant surveillance that solitude felt dangerous and wrong. But Victorian women were far too clever to simply accept this suffocating system without resistance. They developed incredibly sophisticated methods for circumventing their chaperones, creating elaborate codes, signals, and strategies that would make modern teenagers look like amateurs. The accidental encounter became a fine art form. Young ladies would coordinate with their admirers to create seemingly chance meetings at specific locations where brief, supervised conversations could occur. They developed timing systems so precise that couples could meet for exactly the amount of time it took a chaperone to powder her nose or purchase a small item from a shop. Miss Catherine Morrison's diary, preserved in the Morrison family archives, documents the elaborate planning that went into these innocent encounters. She wrote, "Edward and I have perfected the library meeting. When I signal my chaperone that I wish to select a book, she allows me exactly 8 minutes of browsing. Edward arrives at the poetry section precisely 4 minutes after I do, giving us 3 minutes of conversation before I must return to proper supervision." Some women became masters of what they called chaperone management, the art of manipulating their supervisors to create opportunities for more freedom. They learned to identify which chaperones could be distracted by gossip, which ones fell asleep during long carriage rides, and which ones could be convinced to position themselves just far enough away to allow private conversation. The really ingenious women developed what amounted to chaperone training programs. They would carefully select elderly relatives or family friends who were sympathetic to young romance, then gradually educate them about which rules could be bent slightly without causing scandal. Some created elaborate systems where helpful chaperones would appear to be watching closely while actually providing cover for romantic conversations. But the most heartbreaking aspect of the chaperone system was how it affected family relationships. Mothers, sisters, and female relatives were forced to spy on each other constantly. Trust between women in the same family was often impossible because everyone was required to be a surveillance agent for the family's reputation. Mrs. Dorothy Richardson's correspondence with her sister reveals this tragic dynamic. She wrote, "I am trapped in the horrible position of watching dear Sarah like a hawk, knowing that any lapse in my vigilance could destroy her future. Yet I see how my constant supervision is slowly crushing her spirit. She no longer laughs freely or speaks her mind openly. We are becoming strangers to each other, all in the name of protecting her virtue." The economic burden of maintaining proper chaperoning was enormous. Wealthy families employed multiple chaperones to ensure coverage for all their daughters' activities. They hired special chaperones for travel, for social seasons, and for extended visits to other cities. The annual cost of proper chaperoning for a family with multiple daughters could exceed the salary of a middle-class professional. One of the most expensive aspects was what families called chaperone infrastructure. The carriages, seating arrangements, housing accommodations, and social logistics required to maintain proper supervision in all situations. Victorian homes were designed with special chaperone viewing areas, allowing supervisors to monitor drawing room conversations while maintaining the appearance of privacy. The international variations in chaperoning rules created additional complications for traveling families. American chaperone standards were considered too lenient by European families. While European rules were seen as impossibly strict by Americans, British families visiting continental Europe often hired local chaperones to ensure they weren't violating regional expectations. Miss Alice Whitman's travel diary from her 1878 European tour documents the confusion created by these cultural differences. She wrote, "In Paris, our British chaperone was shocked by the freedom allowed to French young ladies, while our French acquaintances were horrified by the restrictions placed upon English girls. I find myself uncertain which rules to follow and terrified of causing offence in either direction." But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the chaperone system was how it created an underground economy of female cooperation. Women developed networks for sharing chaperone services, trading supervision duties, and covering for each other during family emergencies. These networks became some of the strongest female bonds of the Victorian era. Professional chaperones developed their own guild systems with standardized rates, training programs, and codes of conduct. The most sought-after chaperones commanded high salaries and had waiting lists of families hoping to employ them. Some became minor celebrities in their social circles, known for their skill at balancing protection with social advancement for their charges. The psychological effects of constant supervision extended far beyond the chaperone period. Women who had never been alone with men often found marriage traumatic, having had no opportunity to develop normal social skills with opposite sex. Some Victorian brides reported feeling more comfortable with their female chaperones than with their new husbands. The chaperone system also created what historians call artificial intimacy. Because couples had to conduct their entire courtship under supervision, they developed intense romantic feelings based on minimal actual interaction. Many Victorian marriages began between people who had never had a real conversation, leading to profound disappointment when the reality of marriage failed to match the fantasy of supervised courtship. Yet some women found unexpected empowerment within the chaperone system. Older women who served as chaperones often wielded significant social influence, determining which courtships were encouraged and which were discouraged. Some used their positions to help younger women navigate social expectations while maintaining some personal agency. As we continue exploring the intricate web of restrictions that governed Victorian women's lives, Remember that behind every properly chaperoned young lady was a complex support system of women working together to balance social expectations with human needs. But if constant supervision seems overwhelming, prepare yourself for the most intellectually stifling aspect of Victorian life, the vast list of forbidden conversation topics. Because when a woman couldn't even discuss the weather without potential social consequences, every word became a carefully calculated risk. The silence fell like a curtain across the dinner party when Miss Elizabeth Thornton made her fatal mistake. She'd been enjoying a perfectly pleasant conversation about the lovely spring weather when someone mentioned the recent railway expansion. Without thinking, Elizabeth offered her opinion about the economic benefits of improved transportation infrastructure. The gentleman to her left actually gasped. The lady across from her turned pale. Within seconds, Elizabeth realized she'd committed one of Victorian society's most unforgivable sins. She had expressed an intelligent opinion in mixed company. That single comment about railways, factual, harmless and demonstrably correct, would follow Elizabeth for months. She was quietly dropped from guest lists, whispered about as too forward, and eventually had to relocate to another city where her reputation for being dangerously intellectual hadn't preceded her. Welcome to the Victorian conversation minefield, where women navigated daily social interactions through a maze of forbidden topics so extensive that many simply stopped speaking altogether rather than risk social execution for saying the wrong thing. The list of prohibited conversation topics for Victorian ladies wasn't just long. It was practically everything worth discussing. Politics absolutely forbidden. Business matters highly inappropriate. Scientific discoveries too intellectual, literature beyond romantic novels suspiciously masculine. Current events potentially controversial, philosophy dangerously radical. Even discussing the weather could be risky if you demonstrated too much knowledge about meteorology. Mrs. Sarah Ellis, author of the influential 1839 guide, The Women of England, laid out the conversational prison that Victorian ladies inhabited. A woman's conversation should be like morning dew, gentle, refreshing, and leaving no trace of having existed. She should speak of domestic pleasures, simple observations of nature's beauty, and perhaps the most innocent details of social life. Any demonstration of serious thought or worldly knowledge renders her unsuitable for refined company. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Victorian women developed the most sophisticated systems of coded communication you can imagine to share their real thoughts while appearing to discuss only approved topics. They became masters of intellectual espionage, conducting complex philosophical debates disguised as conversations about embroidery patterns. Let me share the incredible story of the Literary Ladies of Concord, a group of Massachusetts women who met weekly for what appeared to be innocent needlework circles. Their meeting notes, discovered in the 1980s, hidden in a false bottom of an antique sewing basket, revealed that these women were actually conducting graduate-level discussions of political theory, economic policy, and social reform, all while appearing to chat about domestic trivia. They developed what they called the domestic translation system. When Mrs. Carolyn Adams wanted to discuss John Stuart Mill's essays on liberty, she would frame it as a conversation about household management strategies. When Miss Dorothy Wright wished to debate the ethics of slavery, she would disguise it as a discussion about challenging domestic situations requiring moral guidance. Their coded minutes are brilliant examples of intellectual resistance. One entry reads, "Today we discussed the most effective methods for managing difficult stains in fine linens," which was actually a debate about political corruption and how to address systemic social problems. Another notes, Mrs. Thompson shared her grandmother's recipe for preserving fruit through harsh winters, code for a passionate argument about women's suffrage strategies. The psychological damage caused by conversational restrictions was severe and well documented. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, America's first female physician, wrote extensively about what she termed intellectual suffocation syndrome, a condition where women developed physical symptoms from suppressing their thoughts and opinions. Dr. Blackwell's 1852 medical journal documents cases of women who developed chronic headaches, digestive problems, and nervous disorders that she directly linked to the stress of constant intellectual suppression. She wrote, "I have observed that women forced to restrict their conversation to approved domestic topics often develop symptoms remarkably similar to those seen in prisoners kept in solitary confinement." But the most heartbreaking aspect wasn't just that women couldn't speak freely. It was how they were trained from childhood to police their own thoughts. Young girls received intensive education in appropriate conversation, learning not just what topics to avoid, but how to stop themselves from even thinking about forbidden subjects. Miss Charlotte Perkins, whose diary from ages 12 to 18 survives in the Schlesinger Library, documented her own intellectual self-destruction with heartbreaking clarity. At 12, she wrote, "I love reading about the discoveries of Mr. Darwin and wonder what it means for our understanding of creation." By 16, her entries show the effects of years of social conditioning. "I caught myself thinking about scientific matters again today. I must train my mind to focus on more suitable subjects for a young lady." The economic impact of conversational restrictions was enormous because it created entire industries devoted to managing women's intellectual lives. Families hired special tutors whose job was not to educate daughters, but to teach them how to appear educated without actually knowing anything, and dangerous. These accomplishment instructors taught young ladies to speak beautifully about approved topics while carefully avoiding any demonstration of real knowledge. The most expensive aspect was what families called intellectual insurance, elaborate systems to ensure their daughters never accidentally revealed forbidden knowledge. Wealthy families employed conversation coaches who would rehearse safe topics with their daughters before social events. They created extensive libraries of approved books and hired readers to pre-screen all materials for potentially corrupting ideas. One Boston family, the Cushings, spent the equivalent of $50,000 annually in today's money on what they called intellectual protection services. They employed a full-time conversation monitor whose job was to attend social events with their daughters and signal them if their conversation was trending toward dangerous territory. The international variations in conversation restrictions created fascinating complications for traveling families. Topics that were acceptable for women to discuss in France were scandalous in England. Subjects that American women could address freely were forbidden to their German counterparts. Some families hired cultural conversation consultants to help them navigate these differences without causing international incidents. Miss Edith Wharton, before she became a famous author, documented these cultural conversation minefields in her early travel diaries. She wrote, "In London, I was cautioned against expressing any opinion about architecture. Though in Paris, such comments were not only acceptable but expected, yet in Paris, my innocent observation about the beauty of the cathedral windows was considered inappropriately intellectual for a young American lady." But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this conversational oppression was how it backfired spectacularly. By forbidding women from discussing important topics openly, Victorian society inadvertently created the most intellectually sophisticated generation of women in history up to that point. These women became experts at disguised intellectual discourse, coded communication, and subversive thinking. They developed what historians now call domestic intellectualism, the ability to conduct serious philosophical, political, and scientific discussions through seemingly innocent conversation about household matters. A discussion about garden planning could actually be a debate about economic theory. A conversation about children's education might be a complex analysis of social reform strategies. The literary evidence for this intellectual resistance is overwhelming. Women's personal letters from the Victorian era reveal minds engaged with the most complex ideas of their time, despite having no official outlet for these thoughts. They read voraciously, thought deeply, and found ways to share their ideas with other women through carefully disguised communication networks. Mrs. Margaret Fuller, one of the few women who managed to break through conversational restrictions and speak publicly, documented the intellectual hunger she observed in women who couldn't express their thoughts freely. She wrote, "I have met seamstresses who understand political economy better than congressmen, housewives who could debate philosophy with university professors, and young ladies whose insights into social problems surpass those of the men who make policy. Yet they must hide their intelligence like a shameful secret." The psychological strategies women developed to cope with conversational restrictions were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to ask questions that allowed men to express the ideas the women weren't allowed to voice themselves. They became expert listeners who could guide conversations toward topics they wanted to explore without appearing to direct the discussion. Some women developed what they called intellectual ventriloquism, the ability to express their ideas through other people's voices. They would pose carefully crafted questions that led men to articulate positions the women supported, then agree enthusiastically as if hearing these ideas for the first time. The most successful practitioners of this technique could conduct entire intellectual debates through a series of strategic questions and responses, never technically violating conversational rules while still engaging with forbidden topics. It was a form of intellectual theatre that required tremendous skill and self-control. The social pleasing of women's conversation was ruthless and comprehensive. Society ladies appointed themselves as conversation monitors, listening carefully for any sign that another woman was stepping outside acceptable boundaries. They developed elaborate reporting systems to ensure that conversational violations were quickly punished through social exclusion. Yet within this oppressive system, some women found unexpected freedom. The very restrictions that were meant to silence them actually created protected spaces for intellectual development, because no one expected women to have serious thoughts. Those who did could often pursue complex ideas without detection, as long as they never expressed them publicly. As we continue exploring the suffocating restrictions that governed every aspect of Victorian women's lives, remember that behind every properly silent lady might have been a brilliant mind working overtime to find ways around society's intellectual prison. But if conversational restrictions seem overwhelming, prepare yourself for the physical restrictions that made even the simplest human contact a potential scandal. Because in a world where shaking hands could ruin reputations, Victorian women had to navigate physical interactions with the precision of bomb disposal experts. One accidental brush of skin against skin could destroy everything. In the autumn of 1852, Miss Helena Ashworth was helping serve tea at her family's social gathering when disaster struck in the most innocent way imaginable. As she handed a cup to Mr. Frederick Hamilton, their fingers touched for perhaps half a second, a barely perceptible contact that should have meant absolutely nothing. But Mrs. Caroline Weatherby, the self-appointed moral guardian of Boston society, witnessed this momentary skin contact and gasped audibly. "Did you see that brazen display?" she whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. Miss Ashworth allowed that gentleman to touch her bare hand. Such forward behavior. Within hours, the story had spread through Boston's social circles, growing more scandalous with each telling. By evening, Helena was being described as having thrown herself at Mr. Hamilton. By the following week, her reputation was so damaged that her family quietly sent her to live with relatives in Philadelphia, hoping distance might allow the scandal to fade. Helena's crime. She had forgotten to wear gloves while serving tea, and a man had accidentally touched her ungloved hand for less than a second. This was the reality of Victorian physical contact rules. A world so obsessed with preventing improper touch that even the most innocent human contact could trigger social catastrophe. And the complexity of these rules created a daily minefield that women had to navigate with the precision of master strategists. Let me explain just how elaborate these physical restrictions were. Victorian ladies were essentially walking in portable isolation chambers. Every inch of their skin, except for their faces, and sometimes their hands, had to be completely covered at all times. But it wasn't enough to simply cover up. The rules governing when, how, and with whom any form of physical contact could occur were so complex they required dedicated instruction manuals. Mrs. Eliza Leslie's 1847 etiquette guide, Miss Leslie's behavior book, devoted 43 pages to proper physical contact protocols. The rules were staggeringly specific. A lady could shake hands with a gentleman only if he initiated the gesture, only while wearing gloves, only for precisely the duration of one heartbeat, and only if appropriate chaperones were present to witness that the contact remained within acceptable bounds. But here's where it gets really fascinating and slightly absurd. The glove industry became one of the most profitable businesses in Victorian society precisely because physical contact without gloves was considered so dangerous. Women owned dozens of pairs of gloves for different occasions, different seasons, and different types of potential contact. There were special gloves for handshaking, different gloves for handling books, and even specific gloves for touching door handles in public places. The psychological impact of this constant physical isolation was devastating. Dr. Margaret Cleaves, one of the first women to study what she called tactile deprivation, documented case after case of Victorian women who developed severe anxiety disorders specifically related to physical contact. In her groundbreaking 1883 study, she wrote, "I have observed women who become genuinely terrified at the prospect of necessary physical contact, even with family members. They have been so thoroughly trained to view touch as dangerous that they can no longer distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate contact." Indeed, Miss Caroline Whitmore's private diary, discovered in the 1970s, provides a heartbreaking window into the psychological effects of these restrictions. She wrote, "I am 24 years old, and I have never felt another person's skin against mine, except when mother helped dress me as a child. I sometimes wonder if I'm even truly human, encased as I am in fabric barriers that prevent me from experiencing the most basic human connection." But Victorian women, being as ingenious as they were oppressed, developed remarkable strategies for creating human connection within these suffocating restrictions. They perfected what historians now call permissible intimacy, ways of creating meaningful physical and emotional connections without violating the technical rules of proper contact. The dance became their primary outlet for sanctioned physical contact. During approved dances, couples could touch hands through gloves, and the gentleman could place his hand on the lady's waist over multiple layers of fabric. For many Victorian couples, these brief dance encounters were the only physical contact they would have during their entire courtship. Mrs. Isabella Montgomery's Dance Instruction Manual from 1856 reveals how seriously these moments were taken. She wrote detailed descriptions of how couples could maximize the emotional connection of sanctioned dance contact. The lady must learn to communicate volumes through the pressure of her gloved hand. The gentleman must interpret the smallest variations in her posture and response. What might appear to observers as simple dancing is actually the most complex form of physical conversation. Some couples became so skilled at this dance communication that they could conduct entire emotional conversations through variations in hand pressure, subtle changes in posture, and carefully timed movements. It was like learning a physical language that had to be spoken through layers of fabric and social restrictions. The really creative women developed what they called indirect contact strategies. They would accidentally drop handkerchiefs so that gentlemen would retrieve them, creating brief moments of proximity. They would arrange to need assistance with books or packages, allowing for momentary contact during the helping process. Some became masters at timing these accidents to create opportunities for connection without technically violating propriety rules. Miss Dorothy Richardson's correspondence with her sister documents some of these strategies with remarkable candor. She wrote, "I have perfected the art of requiring assistance at precisely the right moments. Yesterday, I managed 3 separate instances of necessary help with my parasol, a dropped book, and climbing into the carriage, each creating opportunities for brief but meaningful contact with Mr. Redwoods." While maintaining perfect propriety, the glove industry understood this desperation for human connection and developed increasingly sophisticated products. To address it, they created sensation gloves, ultra-thin silk gloves that allowed more feeling while still maintaining the technical barrier required by society. These gloves cost enormous amounts, but were wildly popular among women who craved more tactile experience. Some manufacturers created gloves with special fingertips that could be discreetly removed for brief moments of direct contact, then quickly replaced. These convertible gloves were advertised in coded language in women's magazines, marketed as providing enhanced dexterity for delicate work, while actually offering opportunities for forbidden skin contact. The most expensive gloves included what manufacturers called sensation windows, tiny openings in the palms that could be covered by decorative panels, allowing for moments of direct touch that could be quickly concealed. These gloves cost the equivalent of $500 in today's money, but were so popular that waiting lists for custom orders stretched for months. The international variations in contact rules created additional complications. American contact standards were considered scandalously lenient by European families, while European restrictions seemed impossibly severe to Americans. Some families traveling internationally hired cultural contact consultants to help them navigate these differences without causing offense. Miss Alice Freeman's travel diary from her 1879 European tour documents the confusion these cultural differences created. She wrote, "In London, I was severely criticized for shaking hands with the gentleman using the casual American method. While in Paris, the English formality I had adopted was seen as cold and insulting. I find myself paralyzed by uncertainty, afraid to touch or be touched by anyone. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of these physical restrictions was how they affected family relationships. Even within families, physical affection was severely limited. Adult siblings, parents and children and other relatives were expected to maintain formal physical boundaries that prevented natural expressions of love and comfort." Mrs. Sarah Joseph Hale, editor of God's Lady's Book, documented this family isolation in her private correspondence. She wrote, "I long to embrace my grown daughters freely, to comfort them with touch when they are sad, to show my affection through natural gestures. Yet society demands that even maternal love be expressed with proper reserve and physical distance." The medical community supported these restrictions with pseudoscientific theories about the dangers of physical contact. Doctors claimed that excessive touching could cause hysteria, moral corruption, and various mysterious ailments. These weren't fringe theories. They were mainstream medical opinions published in respected journals and taught in medical schools. Dr. William Acton, a prominent Victorian physician, wrote extensively about what he called tactile overstimulation, claiming that women who experienced too much physical contact would develop nervous disorders and moral weakness. His 1857 medical guide stated, "The female constitution is so delicately balanced that improper physical contact can permanently damage both mental and physical health." This medical support gave the physical restrictions an air of scientific authority that made them even harder to question or resist. Women who expressed frustration with the isolation were told they were displaying symptoms of the very moral weakness that the restrictions were designed to prevent. Yet some women found ways to resist within the system. They developed elaborate justifications for necessary contact, health concerns that required assistance, religious activities that involved group participation, charitable work that brought them into contact with different social groups. These women became experts at finding loopholes in the physical restriction system. The psychological effects of this physical isolation lasted far beyond the Victorian era itself. Many women who had lived under these restrictions found it difficult to develop normal physical relationships even after social attitudes changed. They had been so thoroughly trained to view touch as dangerous that they struggled to enjoy normal human contact throughout their lives. As we continue exploring the elaborate prison of rules that governed Victorian women's existence, remember that behind every properly distant lady was a human being starving for the most basic form of human connection: simple, natural touch. But if physical contact restrictions seem extreme, wait until you discover the battlefield that was the Victorian ballroom. Because when every dance partner could determine your marriage prospects and every step was evaluated for moral implications, social dancing became a form of warfare where reputations were made and destroyed with every waltz. The small ivory card in Miss Prudence Whitfield's trembling hands held more power than any weapon. It was her dance card for the 1856 Newport Grand Ball. And as she stared at the empty lines where gentlemen's names should be written, she realized her social life was about to end before it had truly begun. By evening's end, that blank dance card would become evidence of her complete social failure, a public record that no gentleman in Newport society considered her worthy of a single waltz. But across the ballroom, Miss Charlotte Morrison's dance card told a different story of disaster. Her card was completely full, dangerously, scandalously full. She had accepted every invitation offered, not understanding that a truly proper lady should refuse some dances to avoid appearing desperate. By accepting all partners, Charlotte had branded herself as forward and immodest. Both women had failed the Victorian ballroom test, but in completely opposite ways. In Victorian society, the ballroom wasn't a place for entertainment. It was a battlefield where marriages were arranged, fortunes were won or lost, and reputations were destroyed with every misstep of the waltz. The dance card system was social warfare disguised as elegant entertainment. These small booklets, often decorated with silk ribbons and hand-painted florals, were actually detailed records of a woman's social value. Every name written on a dance card was evaluated by society observers for its strategic implications. Dancing with the right partners in the right order could launch a woman into social prominence. Making the wrong choices could exile her forever. Mrs. Mudwood Park, writing in her private memoir about 1880s Boston society, described the dance card psychology with remarkable insight. "We approached each ball like generals planning military campaigns. Every potential partner was evaluated not just for personal appeal, but for the message his name on our card would send to other observers. We calculated which dances to accept, which to politely decline, and how to arrange our cards to create the most advantageous narrative of our social connections." But here's what makes this system absolutely mind-blowing. The rules governing dance card etiquette were so complex that wealthy families hired professional consultants to help their daughters navigate ballroom politics. These dance strategists charged enormous fees to study guest lists in advance, identify the most socially advantageous partners, and coach young ladies on optimal dance card management. One of the most successful dance consultants, Mrs. Cornelia Baxter of New York, kept detailed records of her strategies that read like military intelligence reports. Her 1875 client notes include diagrams of ballroom layouts, charts tracking which gentlemen danced with which ladies at previous events, and elaborate algorithms for calculating the social value of different partner combinations. Mrs. Baxter wrote, "Miss Catherine's success at the Astor Ball was no accident. We spent weeks researching every gentleman on the guest list, identifying Mr. Richardson as the most strategically valuable first partner, prominent enough to attract other desirable partners, but not so elevated as to make her appear presumptuous." By the end of the evening, her carefully orchestrated dance card had positioned her as the season's most promising newcomer. The economic stakes of ballroom success were staggering. A single successful ball season could result in a marriage that secured a family's financial future for generations. Conversely, a ballroom disaster could mean permanent exile from society and economic ruin. Families spent fortunes on ball gowns, jewelry, and professional coaching, viewing these expenses as essential investments in their daughters' futures. The detailed financial records kept by the Morrison family of Philadelphia reveal just how expensive ballroom warfare could be. In 1878, they spent $15,000, equivalent to nearly $400,000 today, on their daughter's single ball season, and including $3,000 for gowns, $2,000 for jewelry, $500 for dancing lessons, and $200 for strategic consultation services. But the most fascinating aspect of the dance card system was how it created intricate webs of social intelligence gathering. Society matrons employed networks of observers to track dance card patterns, identify emerging social trends, and report on potential scandals. These ballroom spies could make or break reputations based on their observations and reports. Miss Eleanor Roosevelt's aunt, Mrs. Anna Roosevelt, kept detailed ballroom surveillance records that have been preserved in the Roosevelt family archives. Her notes from the 1883 New York social season read like intelligence briefings. Miss Vanderbilt danced twice with Mr. Whitney. Significant interest indicated. Mrs. A's daughter refused dance with Senator's son. Possible family conflict. Watch for developments. The psychological pressure of ballroom performance was so intense that many young women developed what doctors called ball anxiety, a condition where the mere sight of a dance card could trigger panic attacks. Some women fainted during balls, not from tight corsets, but from the sheer stress of social performance under such intense scrutiny. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a prominent neurologist of the era, documented case after case of young women who developed severe nervous disorders specifically related to ballroom stress. In his 1881 medical journal, he wrote, "I have treated numerous young ladies who exhibit symptoms of extreme anxiety, insomnia, and digestive distress that correlate directly with the social season. The pressure to perform perfectly in ballroom settings appears to create genuine medical conditions that persist long after the dancing ends. But Victorian women, being remarkably resourceful, developed sophisticated strategies for gaming the dance card system. They learned to manipulate partner selection, create artificial scarcity around their availability, and used dance cards as tools for complex social messaging. The most skilled ballroom politicians developed what they called strategic incompleteness, deliberately leaving certain dances open on their cards to create the impression that they were selective about partners. They would accept invitations from moderately desirable gentlemen for early dances, then use the social credibility gained from those partnerships to attract more prestigious partners for later dances. Miss Julia Grant, daughter of President Ulysses Grant, perfected a technique she called cascade partnering, beginning each ball with a respectable but not spectacular partner, then using each subsequent dance to move up the social hierarchy. Her dance cards from the 1870s, preserved in the Grant family papers, show remarkable strategic progression from adequate to excellent partners throughout each evening. Some women became masters of what historians call dance card diplomacy, using their cards to send complex political and social messages. By choosing to dance with representatives of feuding families, they could position themselves as peacemakers. By dancing with politically connected partners, they could signal their family's allegiances. By refusing certain invitations, they could communicate disapproval or social boundaries. The international implications of dance card politics were enormous. American women visiting European courts had to master completely different ballroom protocols, while European ladies traveling to America often found their sophisticated continental strategies misinterpreted as coldness or snobbishness. Princess Alexandra of Denmark's 1876 visit to New York created what society observers called the Great Dance Card Crisis, when her European customs conflicted with American ballroom expectations. Her refusal to dance more than once with any gentleman, perfectly proper by Danish court standards, was interpreted by American society as insulting rejection of their hospitality. The physical demands of ballroom warfare were as challenging as the social requirements. Victorian ball gowns weighed 20 to 30 lb and required such restrictive corsetry that many women could barely breathe, let alone dance gracefully. Yet, they were expected to maintain perfect composure and elegant movement throughout hours of continuous dancing. The dance instruction industry became enormously profitable as families sought to give their daughters competitive advantages. Master dance instructors charged fees equivalent to university tuition to teach not just steps, but the subtle art of ballroom communication. How to convey interest or disinterest through dance movements. How to position oneself advantageously during partner changes. How to recover gracefully from mistakes. Monsieur Auguste Duron, a famous New York dancing master, developed what he called strategic choreography, specialized techniques that allowed ladies to showcase their grace while positioning themselves for optimal partner visibility. His students paid premium rates to learn these competitive dancing strategies. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of ballroom culture was how it created opportunities for women to exercise real influence despite their official powerlessness. Skilled ballroom politicians could arrange marriages, broker business deals, and shape social hierarchies through strategic dance partner management. Mrs. Carolyn Shermer Hornester, the undisputed queen of New York society, used her ballroom influence to control which families could enter elite circles. Her approval, demonstrated through dance invitations at her balls, could launch social careers. Her disapproval, shown through strategic exclusion, could destroy them. The psychological legacy of ballroom warfare extended far beyond the dancing itself. Women who succeeded in this system developed remarkable skills in social strategy, alliance building, and influence management that served them throughout their lives. Those who failed often carried the trauma of public social failure for decades. As we delve deeper into the elaborate social mechanisms that controlled Victorian women's lives, remember that behind every graceful waltz was a woman navigating one of the most competitive and unforgiving social systems ever created. But if ballroom politics seem complex, prepare yourself for the most intimate battlefield of all, Victorian letter writing. Because when every piece of correspondence could be intercepted, analyzed, and used as evidence of impropriety, women had to become master cryptographers just to maintain private relationships. The letter that destroyed Emma Hartwell's life contained nothing more scandalous than a recipe for apple preserves and news about her cousin's new baby. But hidden within those innocent domestic details was a love affair so passionate and a plan so daring that when her father discovered the secret meaning, he burned every letter Emma had ever received and locked her in her room for 3 months. Emma's crime wasn't writing improper letters. It was becoming a master of Victorian cryptography, turning ordinary correspondence into vehicles for forbidden romance through a code, so sophisticated that it took her father weeks to crack it. This was the reality of Victorian letter writing, a world where privacy was considered dangerous, where every piece of correspondence could be intercepted and analysed, and where women had to become master spies just to maintain personal relationships. Victorian mail was not private. Parents routinely read their daughters' letters, husbands monitored their wives' correspondence, and even servants were encouraged to report suspicious postal activity. The concept of confidential communication was considered both impractical and morally questionable. If you weren't doing anything wrong, why would you need privacy? Mrs. Sarah Joseph Hale, the influential editor of God's Lady's book, made this invasion of privacy sound virtuous in her 1841 advice column. A lady's correspondence should be as transparent as her character. Any desire for secretive communication suggests a tendency toward impropriety that must be carefully monitored by loving family members. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Victorian women responded to this surveillance by developing some of the most sophisticated secret communication systems in history. They turned letter writing into an art form of resistance, creating codes so clever that modern cryptographers study them with admiration. The most basic technique was what women called domestic embedding, hiding real messages within seemingly innocent household correspondence. A letter about preserving fruit might actually be instructions for preserving a secret relationship. Discussion of a garden planning could be code for escape planning. Recipe sharing often concealed romantic declarations. Miss Charlotte Cushman's correspondence with her friend Miss Matilda Hayes, preserved in the Library of Congress, provides stunning examples of this technique. On the surface, Charlotte's letters appear to be chatty updates about theatrical performances and social calls. But when decoded using the system the women developed, they reveal passionate love letters between two women conducting a secret romantic relationship. One letter appears to be about rearranging furniture. I have moved the rose-colored chair to face the eastern window, where it catches the morning light most beautifully. The small table beside it now holds only the most treasured items. Decoded, this translates to, I have arranged for us to meet at sunrise in the rose garden. I will bring only the letters you have written to me. But domestic embedding was just the beginning. Advanced practitioners developed what historians call literary cryptography, using references to books, poems, and plays to communicate complex messages that would be invisible to casual readers but clear to intended recipients. The system worked by referencing specific pages, lines, or characters from well-known works. A casual mention of Jaya's difficult decision in chapter 15 might actually be a reference to a specific passage that conveyed the writer's feelings about her own romantic situation. Discussion of Shakespeare's heroines could communicate detailed emotional states and relationship developments. Miss Emily Dickinson, though she lived as a recluse, maintained extensive correspondence using these techniques. Her letters, which appear to be discussions of literature and philosophy, often contained elaborate coded messages about her emotional life and relationships. Modern scholars have identified at least 12 different coding systems in her correspondence. The most sophisticated women developed what they called musical messaging, using references to songs, compositions, and musical performances to convey information. Since music was considered an appropriate feminine interest, letters filled with musical discussion appeared completely innocent, while actually conducting complex covert communication. Mrs. Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, sister of composer Felix Mendelssohn, used musical coding in her correspondence with other female musicians across Europe. Her letters about musical compositions often contained detailed information about women's rights activities, business arrangements, and political opinions that would have been scandalous if expressed directly. One of her letters, ostensibly about a piano sonata, actually contains a coded message about organizing a women's charity fund. The opening movement requires delicate fingering, but builds to surprising strength. The second movement should be played softly with careful attention to the underlying harmony. The finale demands courage and precision, bringing all themes together in triumphant resolution. The psychological pressure of maintaining these coding systems was enormous. Women had to master multiple encryption techniques, remember complex reference systems, and maintain perfect consistency in their codes, while appearing to write natural, unguarded letters. A single mistake could expose entire networks of secret communication. Miss Catherine Beecher's diary documents the mental strain of this constant cryptographic work. I find myself exhausted by the effort required to write even the simplest letter. Every word must be chosen not only for its surface meaning, but for its coded significance. I must remember which references Susan understands, which phrases Maria recognizes, and which topics might alert father to our real communication. It is like performing 3 different conversations simultaneously. The economic impact of this letter surveillance was substantial. Families employed servants specifically to monitor postal activities, track correspondence patterns, and report suspicious communication. Some wealthy families hired professional letter analyzers, educated individuals who specialized in detecting coded messages in seemingly innocent correspondence. The most paranoid families installed elaborate mail interception systems. They arranged with postal workers to secretly copy letters before delivery, employed handwriting experts to detect emotional undertones in correspondence, and even hired former military intelligence officers to analyze their daughters' mail for signs of inappropriate relationships. Mrs. Hamilton Fish, wife of President Grant, Secretary of State, employed what she called a correspondent security system that included 3 different people analyzing her daughter's mail. The family papers preserved in the Library of Congress include monthly reports on the daughter's postal activities that read like intelligence briefings. But the most heartbreaking aspect of this surveillance was how it destroyed trust within families. Mothers were forced to spy on daughters, sisters monitored each other's correspondence, and even close friends couldn't trust that their letters would remain confidential. The very relationships that should have provided emotional support became sources of suspicion and betrayal. Miss Louisa May Alcott's private journals reveal her anguish about this family surveillance. I can no longer write freely, even to my own sister, knowing that father reads every letter before it leaves this house. My most intimate thoughts, my deepest feelings, must be hidden behind layers of careful language. I feel as though I'm slowly disappearing, becoming nothing more than the proper words that others expect to read. The international implications of letter surveillance created additional complications for traveling families and international relationships. Letters crossing borders were subject to government censorship as well as family monitoring. Women corresponding with friends or relatives in other countries had to navigate not only family expectations but also political sensitivities. Some women developed international coding networks that could function across different languages and cultures. These systems required incredible linguistic sophistication and cultural knowledge. Women would spend years learning foreign languages, not for travel or education, but specifically to create additional layers of coded communication that would be harder for authorities to detect. The technological limitations of Victorian communication actually helped women maintain some security. Since telegrams were expensive and necessarily brief, families couldn't monitor them as carefully as letters. Some women developed telegram coding systems for emergency communication, using apparently innocent messages about family health or household matters to convey urgent information. Miss Helen Hunt Jackson, the famous author, perfected what she called emergency telegraphy, a system for sending coded information through commercial telegrams. Her coded telegram, "Grandmother's roses blooming early this year, stop, expect abundant harvest, stop," was actually a message to her friend about the success of a women's suffrage petition drive. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Victorian letter surveillance was how it backfired. By forcing women to become skilled cryptographers, the surveillance system actually enhanced their intellectual capabilities. Women who learned to write in code developed advanced skills in language manipulation, logical thinking, and strategic planning that served them well in other areas of life. The women who mastered these communication systems often became leaders in later social reform movements. Their experience in covert organization, secure communication, and network building proved invaluable when they began working for women's rights, charitable causes, and social change. Dr. Frances Willard, who became a prominent temperance leader, attributed her organizational skills directly to her Victorian letter-writing experience. Years of conducting important conversations through coded correspondence taught me how to build networks, maintain security, and coordinate complex activities while appearing to pursue entirely innocent domestic interests. As we continue exploring the intricate web of restrictions that shaped Victorian women's daily existence, remember that behind every properly censored letter was often a brilliant mind finding ways to preserve human connection and personal agency despite overwhelming surveillance. But if the surveillance of personal correspondence seems oppressive, prepare yourself for the physical restrictions that literally shaped women's bodies. Because the Victorian obsession with proper posture and movement created medical consequences so severe that many women's skeletons were permanently deformed by the demands of appearing ladylike. Standing perfectly still was slowly killing Margaret Thornfield, one breath at a time. At 19, she had already mastered the Victorian lady's posture requirements: shoulders back but not too rigid, spine straight but gracefully curved, head held high but not proudly tilted, arms positioned precisely at her sides with hands folded in exact angles. She could maintain this proper position for hours during social calls, never slouching, never shifting, never allowing her body to betray any hint of discomfort or natural movement. What Margaret didn't know was that her dedication to perfect ladylike deportment was systematically destroying her skeleton. The rigid corset that created her fashionable 18-in waist was crushing her lower ribs, displacing her internal organs, and restricting her breathing to such shallow gasps that her brain was perpetually oxygen deprived. The steel spinal support built into her dress was forcing her vertebrae into an unnatural curve that would cause chronic pain for the rest of her life. By age 25, Margaret would be unable to take a deep breath. By 30, she would require assistance to walk upstairs. By 35, she would be classified as an invalid, spending her remaining years confined to specially designed chairs that supported her irreversibly damaged spine. Margaret's tragedy was that she followed every rule perfectly, and that perfect adherence to Victorian posture requirements was literally a form of slow-motion torture. The Victorian obsession with ladylike posture wasn't just about appearance. It was about creating physical proof of a woman's moral character through her body's rigid control. A lady who could maintain perfect posture despite discomfort was demonstrating her superior breeding, self-discipline, and spiritual refinement. Slouching, shifting, or showing any sign of physical discomfort was evidence of moral weakness. Mrs. Harvey Newcomb's 1848 Etiquette Guide, the Young Lady's Guide to Harmonious Development, laid out the physical requirements with military precision. A lady's spine should form a gentle scurve, maintained without effort or consciousness. Her shoulders must remain level and drawn slightly back, creating an elegant line from neck to waist. Her neck should be elongated, supporting the head in a position that suggests both dignity and submission. Any deviation from this posture indicates poor breathing and insufficient self-control. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. Victorian doctors not only supported these destructive posture requirements, they prescribed even more extreme measures for women who couldn't achieve the ideal naturally. They developed elaborate systems of braces, supports and corrective devices that forced women's bodies into positions that created permanent skeletal damage. Dr. Louis Sy, a prominent New York orthopedic surgeon, invented what he called posture correction machinery, elaborate contraptions made of steel and leather that forced women's spines into what he considered proper curves. His 1877 medical journal articles described these devices with disturbing enthusiasm. The female spine, being naturally weaker than the male, requires mechanical assistance to achieve the moral and aesthetic standards appropriate to refined womanhood. Dr. C's patients included hundreds of women from prominent families who submitted to having their bodies encased in his mechanical contraptions for months at a time. His detailed case studies, preserved in medical archives, document the devastating effects of his treatments. Fractured ribs, compressed organs, severe breathing difficulties, and permanent spinal deformities. One of his patients, identified only as Miss C.W. in his notes, was strapped into his posture correction device for 8 months to treat what he diagnosed as moral slouching. By the end of her treatment, she had lost 30 pounds, developed chronic bronchitis from restricted breathing, and suffered what we now recognize as severe depression from prolonged physical torture. Dr. C recorded her outcome as a complete success, because she could finally maintain the required posture without conscious effort. The corset industry built enormous profits on the systematic destruction of women's bodies. The average Victorian lady owned between 8 and 15 corsets, each designed for different activities and levels of restriction. Morning corsets allowed slightly more movement for household activities. Afternoon corsets provided moderate restriction for social calls. Evening corsets created the most dramatic silhouettes for formal events, often reducing waist measurements by 6 to 8 in. Mrs. Roxy Ann Kaplan, one of London's most successful corset manufacturers, kept detailed records of her clients' measurements that reveal the progressive body deformation caused by long-term corset wear. Her files show women whose natural waist measurements decreased by 10 to 12 in over periods of 5 to 10 years, indicating permanent skeletal changes. But the most shocking evidence comes from Victorian medical autopsies. Dr. Robert Dickinson, who conducted detailed anatomical studies of deceased Victorian women, documented systematic organ displacement in over 90% of his subjects. He found livers compressed into unnatural shapes, ribs bent inward at impossible angles, and spinal columns curved so severely that normal organ function was impossible. Dr. Dickinson's 1887 medical report stated, "I have never examined the body of a lady from fashionable society whose internal anatomy has not been permanently altered by corseting. The degree of deformity varies, but some level of organ displacement and skeletal damage appears universal among women who have maintained proper posture requirements throughout their lives." The breathing restrictions caused by Victorian posture requirements created what doctors called fashionable consumption, a condition that mimicked tuberculosis, but was actually caused by chronic oxygen deprivation. Women developed the pale, ethereal appearance that was considered beautiful, not realizing they were slowly suffocating themselves. Miss Caroline Norton, a prominent writer of the era, documented her own experience with posture-induced breathing problems in her private medical diary. I find that maintaining proper carriage allows me only the most shallow breathing. After social events requiring extended proper posture, I often experience dizziness, heart palpitations, and a peculiar floating sensation. My physician assures me these symptoms indicate my successful achievement of refined feminine delicacy. The walking requirements were equally destructive. Ladies were expected to move with what etiquette manuals called gliding grace, a walking style that eliminated any sign of natural stride, hip movement, or normal gait. This required shortening steps to mere inches, keeping legs perfectly straight, and moving without any visible effort or exertion. Mrs. Eliza Leslie's walking instruction manual described the proper technique. A lady should appear to float rather than walk, her feet barely visible beneath her skirts, her movement so smooth and controlled that observers cannot detect the mechanics of locomotion. Each step should be precisely controlled, creating the illusion that she moves through divine grace rather than physical effort. Achieving this floating walk required developing artificial muscle patterns that were biomechanically devastating. Women had to suppress their natural gait, engage their core muscles continuously, and maintain rigid spinal alignment while moving. This unnatural movement pattern caused chronic hip problems, back pain, and leg muscle atrophy. The medical evidence for walking-related injuries in Victorian women is overwhelming. Hospital records from London, New York, and Boston show dramatically higher rates of hip disorders, spinal problems, and leg muscle weakness in women compared to men. These weren't natural age-related changes. They were the direct result of spending decades walking in ways that contradicted normal human biomechanics. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, one of the first women to study female-specific medical issues, conducted groundbreaking research on Victorian posture-related injuries. Her 1886 study followed 200 women over a 10-year period, documenting the progressive physical damage caused by maintaining proper ladylike deport. Dr. Jacobs' findings were shocking. 78% of her subjects developed chronic back pain by age 30. 65% experienced breathing difficulties that interfered with normal activities. 45% developed what she termed disabilities, physical limitations directly caused by years of maintaining artificial posture and movement patterns. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of these physical restrictions was how they affected women's relationship with their own bodies. Victorian ladies were trained from childhood to ignore physical discomfort, to suppress natural movement impulses, and to view their bodies as objects to be controlled rather than lived in. Miss Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who later became a prominent feminist writer, documented her own struggle with Victorian body training in her adolescent diary. I find myself constantly fighting against my body's natural inclinations. When I want to stretch, I must remain rigid. When I need to breathe deeply, I must maintain shallow, ladylike breathing. When I feel like running or jumping, I must glide with proper restraint. I am becoming a stranger to my own physical self. The international variations in posture requirements created additional challenges for traveling families. American posture standards were considered too relaxed by European families. While European requirements seemed impossibly rigid to Americans, some families hired posture consultants to help their daughters adapt to different cultural expectations without causing permanent damage. The economic cost of maintaining proper posture was enormous. Beyond the obvious expenses of corsets and specialized clothing, families paid for posture instruction, corrective devices, medical treatments for posture-related problems, and specialized furniture designed to support artificially positioned bodies. Some entrepreneurs built entire businesses around Victorian posture requirements. They offered posture boarding schools where young ladies lived for months, learning proper deportment, posture correction services that promised to fix existing problems, and even posture insurance policies that compensated families for medical expenses related to department training. Yet within this system of physical oppression, some women found ways to resist. They developed discrete exercises that could be performed while maintaining proper appearance, learned breathing techniques that maximized oxygen intake within corset restrictions, and created support networks where women could safely discuss and address the physical damage caused by beauty requirements. The legacy of Victorian posture requirements extended far beyond the era itself. Many women who lived through this period never recovered normal body function, spending their later years dealing with chronic pain and disability caused by decades of artificial physical restraint. As we near the end of our exploration of Victorian women's restrictive world, remember that behind every gracefully gliding lady was a human being whose natural movement and physical health had been sacrificed to create an artificial ideal of feminine perfection. But not all Victorian women accepted these restrictions passively. Some fought back with courage and creativity that would change history forever. Because when oppression becomes unbearable, resistance becomes inevitable. And the women who broke free from these suffocating rules paved the way for everything we take for granted about freedom today. The morning Elizabeth Cady Stanton cut off her hair, burned her corset, and walked out of her house wearing bloomers. She didn't just break Victorian fashion rules, she declared war on the entire system that had kept women imprisoned in silk and submission for generations. The year was 1848, and Elizabeth's radical act of rebellion would inspire a revolution that changed the world forever. But Elizabeth wasn't the only one fighting back. Across America and Europe, women were finding increasingly creative and courageous ways to resist the suffocating restrictions we've been exploring together. Some rebelled quietly, others dramatically, but all of them were part of a growing movement that refused to accept that being born female meant accepting a lifetime of artificial limitations. What's absolutely remarkable about these rebel women is how they turned the very restrictions meant to control them into weapons of resistance. They used their ladylike skills, those elaborate communication systems, strategic social abilities, and careful observation techniques we've discussed to organize one of the most effective resistance movements in human history. Meet Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who in 1849 became the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States. But here's what makes her story truly incredible. She didn't just break the barrier to medical school, she completely destroyed the Victorian myth of female intellectual inferiority while appearing to conform to every rule of proper feminine behavior. Elizabeth understood that direct confrontation would fail, so she developed what historians call strategic compliance. She wore the most fashionable dresses, maintained perfect posture, spoke in the gentle tones expected of ladies, and never directly challenged male authority. But behind this facade of proper femininity, she was systematically proving that women could master the most complex scientific and medical knowledge. Her private letters reveal the psychological toll of this double life. I must be twice as knowledgeable as any male student, yet appear half as ambitious. I must excel in every examination while seeming surprised by my own success. I must revolutionize medicine while convincing everyone that I am simply a lady with an unusual hobby. Dr. Blackwell's strategy worked so well that many of her male colleagues actually supported her, believing they were helping a charming lady pursue a harmless interest rather than enabling a revolution. By the time they realized what had happened, she had opened the first medical college for women and trained hundreds of female physicians. But some women chose more dramatic forms of rebellion. Frances Wright, a Scottish-born reformer, shocked American society in the 1820s by becoming the first woman to speak publicly to mixed audiences about political issues. But Frances didn't just break speaking rules. She completely rejected the entire Victorian ideal of feminine behavior. She wore men's clothing when it suited her purposes, traveled alone across dangerous territory, lived openly with men without marriage, and expressed radical opinions about everything from slavery to women's rights. Society branded her the great red harlot of infidelity, but Frances embraced the scandal, using it to attract attention to her causes. Frances's public speaking events became legendary spectacles. Thousands of people would attend, some to hear her radical ideas, others hoping to witness a woman destroy herself through improper behavior. But Frances was brilliant at using society's expectations against itself. She would begin each speech in perfectly ladylike fashion, then gradually build to revolutionary conclusions that left audiences stunned. One witness described a technique. Miss Wright began so sweetly discussing the importance of education in such gentle tones that even the most conservative gentleman nodded approval. But by her conclusion, she had logically led us to the inevitable conclusion that women deserved equal political rights, and we found ourselves applauding ideas we would have rejected if presented differently. The most ingenious rebels were those who worked within the system while secretly undermining it. Take Lucretia Mott, who used her position as a Quaker minister's wife to organize what became the women's rights movement. Lucretia understood that Victorian society respected religious women, so she framed feminist activities as Christian duties. She organized the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in the United States, by presenting it as a religious gathering to discuss women's moral responsibilities. The 300 attendees thought they were coming to a traditional ladies' religious meeting. Instead, they found themselves part of the birth of organized feminism in America. Lucretia's organizational genius lay in using Victorian communication networks, those calling card systems, correspondence networks, and social visiting customs. We've explored to build a nationwide movement. She transformed ladies' tea parties into strategy sessions, turned charity work into political organizing, and used the very social restrictions meant to control women as cover for revolutionary planning. Some women rebelled through their professional achievements, proving that female delicacy was a myth. Harriet Martineau became one of the most influential economists and social theorists of her era, writing complex analyses of political and economic systems that male scholars couldn't match. But Harriet was clever about presentation. She published her radical economic theories as observations rather than arguments, allowing male readers to accept her ideas without feeling threatened. Her technique was psychological genius. Instead of declaring, "I believe the economic system is unjust," she would write, "I have observed curious inconsistencies in economic arrangements that perhaps deserve masculine analysis." Male economists would then develop her ideas further, often without realizing they were building on concepts originated by a woman. The fashion rebels were particularly effective because they attacked the most visible symbols of female oppression. Amelia Bloomer didn't just create the famous Bloomer costume. She launched an entire movement of women who refused to wear clothes that damaged their health or restricted their movement. The Bloomer outfit consisted of a knee-length dress worn over loose trousers, eliminating the need for corsets and massive skirts. But Amelia was strategic about promoting it. She didn't present bloomers as a radical feminist statement. She marketed them as a practical health improvement that would help women be better wives and mothers. Her magazine, The Lily, promoted dress reform through medical arguments and domestic efficiency claims. She published testimonials from doctors supporting comfortable clothing and from husbands whose wives had become healthier and more energetic after abandoning corsets. By framing rebellion as domestic improvement, Amelia made it socially acceptable for women to reject physically damaging fashion requirements. The international scope of women's rebellion was remarkable. In France, George Sand scandalized society by wearing men's clothing and smoking cigarettes in public while pursuing a successful career as a novelist. In England, Mary Wollstonecraft had already written a vindication of the rights of women in 1792, laying intellectual groundwork for later rebels. But perhaps the most effective rebels were those who worked collectively to create alternative systems. The women's club movement of the late Victorian era created parallel social structures where women could exercise leadership, discuss forbidden topics, and develop skills that society normally denied them. These clubs appeared to be innocent ladies' improvement societies focused on literature, art, and charitable work, but they were actually functioning as women's universities, business networks, and political organizations. Members learned public speaking, financial management, organizational leadership, and strategic planning, skills that prepared them for larger roles in society. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, founded in 1890, eventually included over 1 million members across the United States. These women used their domestic concerns as justification for involvement in politics, arguing that protecting families required addressing issues like sanitation, education, and political corruption. Some of the most courageous rebels were working-class women who couldn't afford the luxury of gradual reform. The Lowell Mill Girls in Massachusetts organized some of America's first labor strikes, demanding better working conditions and fair wages. These women faced not only economic retaliation, but also social condemnation for violating expectations of feminine passivity. Sarah Bagley, a mill worker who became a prominent labor organizer, used Victorian communication techniques to coordinate strikes across multiple factories. She organized what appeared to be social visiting among factory girls, but was actually strategic planning for labor actions. Her ability to use feminine social customs as cover for radical organizing made her one of the most effective labor leaders of her era. The psychological courage required for Victorian rebellion cannot be overstated. These women faced complete social ostracism, economic ruin, and sometimes physical danger for challenging accepted norms. They had to overcome not just external opposition, but also internal conditioning that told them resistance was unnatural and wrong. Many rebel women documented the emotional cost of their choices. Susan B. Anthony wrote about the isolation of being constantly criticized and misunderstood. There are days when I wonder if the price of progress is worth the personal cost. To be perpetually branded as unnatural, unwomanly, dangerous. It requires a strength I sometimes fear I do not possess. Yet these women persevered because they understood that their individual sacrifices were creating possibilities for future generations. They were willing to be branded as failures as women in order to expand the definition of what women could become. The legacy of these Victorian rebels is everywhere around us today. Every time a woman speaks her mind freely, pursues higher education, chooses her own clothing, or participates in politics, she's exercising freedoms that seemed impossible just 150 years ago. But here's what might surprise you. Despite all the progress these brave women achieved, many of the restrictions they fought against haven't disappeared completely. They've just evolved, becoming more subtle, but still influencing how women are expected to behave, dress, and present themselves in modern society. As we conclude our journey through the bizarre and restrictive world of Victorian women's etiquette, let's explore how these historical restrictions continue to echo in contemporary life, and why understanding this past is crucial for recognizing the invisible rules that still shape women's lives today. When Sarah walked into her office meeting last Tuesday wearing a bright red dress, she had no idea she was about to experience a Victorian etiquette rule that refuses to die. Her male colleague's first comment wasn't about her presentation or her ideas. It was about her bold color choice and whether she was trying to make a statement. Another co-worker whispered that the dress was a bit much for the workplace. By lunch, Sarah found herself questioning whether her clothing had somehow undermined her professional credibility. What Sarah didn't realize is that she had just encountered the ghost of Victorian color restrictions, where women who wore bright colors were considered attention-seeking and morally questionable. Over 150 years later, that same judgment was still operating in her modern workplace, disguised as professional dress standards. This is the unsettling truth about Victorian women's restrictions. They didn't disappear when the era ended. They evolved, adapted, and found new ways to influence how women are expected to behave, dress, and present themselves in the 21st century. And recognizing these connections isn't just fascinating history, it's essential for understanding the invisible forces that still shape women's lives today. Let's start with something that might shock you. Modern dress codes. Walk into any corporate office, and you'll find detailed guidelines about appropriate women's attire that would make Victorian etiquette writers proud. Women's clothing must not be distracting, too revealing or unprofessional. Language that echoes the Victorian obsession with controlling female appearance to prevent moral corruption. Dr. Jennifer Baumgartner, a researcher who studied workplace dress codes across 500 American companies, found that 89% had specific restrictions for women's clothing that didn't apply to men. These included rules about skirt length, neckline depth, sleeve coverage, color intensity, and even makeup application. Her 2019 study revealed that women's dress code violations were reported 3 times more frequently than men's. And women faced more severe consequences for appearance-related infractions. One particularly telling example comes from a 2020 case where a female investment banker was passed over for promotion, partly because her supervisor noted that her colorful wardrobe choices suggested a lack of seriousness about her career. The colors in question, the same jewel tones that Victorian society considered inappropriate for respectable ladies. Emerald green, sapphire blue, and burgundy red. But clothing restrictions are just the beginning. The Victorian obsession with controlling women's voices has evolved into modern expectations about how women should speak in professional and social settings. Women are still expected to use softer tones, avoid seeming too aggressive, and moderate their opinions to avoid appearing difficult or confrontational. Linguistic researcher Dr. Carmen Fort analyzed thousands of hours of workplace recordings and found that women who spoke with the same directness and authority as their male colleagues were consistently rated as less likable and harder to work with. Her research revealed that successful women had unconsciously learned to use linguistic strategies remarkably similar to those Victorian ladies used to express opinions without appearing too forward. Modern women often preface strong statements with softening language. "I might be wrong, or this is just my opinion." But these phrases serve exactly the same function as Victorian ladies, careful conversational strategies. They allow women to express ideas while appearing appropriately humble and non-threatening. The Victorian restriction on women showing expertise has a direct descendant in what researchers call impostor syndrome. The feeling that you don't deserve your achievements and will be exposed as a fraud. While this affects people of all genders, studies consistently show it impacts women disproportionately, particularly in fields traditionally dominated by men. Dr. Pauline Rose Clans, who first identified imposter syndrome, found that 70% of people experience it at some point, but women were twice as likely to experience it chronically and severely. Her research suggested that this stems partly from historical conditioning that taught women to doubt their own capabilities and downplay their achievements to avoid seeming unfeminine. The Victorian ankle obsession has evolved into modern society's fixation on women's bodies and the constant policing of female appearance. The same energy that once went into hiding ankles now focuses on controlling women's weight, aging, and physical presentation. The corset industry has been replaced by shapewear, diet culture, and cosmetic procedures that promise to help women achieve artificially perfect appearances. The global shapewear market, worth over $3 billion annually, essentially sells modern corsets with prettier marketing. Women still compress their bodies into uncomfortable garments to achieve socially acceptable silhouettes. The difference is that now we call it confidence wear instead of moral necessity. But the underlying message remains the same. Women's natural bodies need correction to be acceptable. Social media has created what researchers call digital chaperones. The constant awareness that every interaction is potentially being watched and judged by an invisible audience. This mirrors the Victorian chaperone system, where women lived under perpetual surveillance that shaped their behavior even when they were technically alone. Dr. Sherry Turkle's research on social media's psychological effects found that young women in particular develop what she calls performance anxiety around their online presence. They curate their posts, photos, and comments with the same careful attention to propriety that Victorian ladies applied to their public appearances. The fear of saying or posting something that could damage their reputation creates a form of self-censorship remarkably similar to Victorian conversation restrictions. The calling card system has been reborn as professional networking, where women are still judged by their associations and must carefully manage their social connections to maintain professional credibility. LinkedIn profiles function like modern calling cards, displaying carefully curated information about one's social and professional networks. But perhaps the most direct descendant of Victorian restrictions is the persistent expectation that women should be primarily focused on relationships and family, even when pursuing demanding careers. The second shift phenomenon, where working women are expected to maintain primary responsibility for household management and childcare, directly echoes Victorian assumptions about women's natural domestic obligations. The 2020 US Census revealed that women still perform 2.6 times more unpaid household labor than men, even when both partners work full-time. This isn't just personal choice. It reflects deeply embedded cultural expectations that trace directly back to Victorian ideals about women's primary roles and responsibilities. Modern dating culture has preserved many Victorian courtship restrictions in new forms. Women are still often expected to be less sexually forward, to wait for men to initiate relationships, and to moderate their ambitions to avoid intimidating potential partners. Dating advice for women frequently echoes Victorian warnings about appearing too eager or too independent. A 2021 study by Dr. Jessica Carbino, who analyzed millions of dating app interactions, found that women who displayed high professional achievement in their profiles received 23% fewer matches than those who emphasized more traditionally feminine interests. The data suggested that many people still unconsciously associate female ambition with unattractiveness, a direct echo of Victorian fears about women stepping outside their prescribed roles. The physical restrictions haven't disappeared either. They've just become medicalized. Women are still encouraged to modify their natural body functions and appearances to meet social expectations. The birth control industry, cosmetic surgery market, and anti-aging industry all profit from the idea that women's natural bodies need correction and control. High heels, which cause documented foot, back and posture problems, remain expected professional attire for women in many industries. The medical evidence against prolonged high heel wearing mirrors, Victorian doctors' warnings about corsets, yet social pressure to wear them persists. Some companies have only recently stopped requiring high heels as part of women's dress codes, and many women still feel professional pressure to wear them. The mourning requirements have evolved into expectations about how women should handle emotional pain and trauma. Women are often expected to process grief, depression and trauma in ways that don't inconvenience others or challenge social comfort. The Victorian requirement to perform appropriate levels of sorrow has become modern pressure to bounce back quickly from difficult experiences while maintaining professional and social obligations. Even the conversation restrictions persist in subtle forms. Women who speak passionately about political issues are often labelled shrill or hysterical, language that directly echoes Victorian warnings about women becoming too emotional about inappropriate subjects. Female politicians and public figures face scrutiny about their tone, demeanour and emotional expression that their male counterparts rarely experience. The international scope of these persistent restrictions is remarkable. Studies from countries across Europe, Asia and the Americas show similar patterns of evolved Victorian restrictions affecting women's professional and personal lives. The specific details vary by culture, but the underlying theme of controlling and limiting women's behaviour through social pressure remains consistent. What makes these modern restrictions particularly insidious is their invisibility. Unlike Victorian rules, which were explicitly stated and socially acknowledged, today's restrictions operate through subtle social cues, implicit biases, and internalized expectations that many people don't consciously recognize. Dr. Virginia Vallion's research on gender schemas, unconscious mental frameworks that shape how we perceive and evaluate men and women, revealed that these biases affect everything from job evaluations to social interactions. Often without anyone realizing it's happening, people who consciously support gender equality can still unconsciously apply different standards to women's behavior, appearance and capabilities. But here's what gives me hope. Understanding these connections empowers us to recognize and challenge them. When we see how Victorian restrictions evolved rather than disappeared, we can identify their modern forms and make conscious choices about whether to accept or resist them. The women who fought Victorian restrictions didn't just win freedom for themselves, they began a process of transformation that continues today. Every time a modern woman recognizes an invisible restriction and chooses to challenge it, she's continuing the work that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, and countless other rebels began over a century ago. As we conclude our journey through the strange, restrictive, and ultimately transformative world of Victorian women's etiquette, let's reflect on what we've learned about the persistence of control, the power of resistance, and the ongoing struggle for genuine equality that connects us directly to those brave women who refused to accept that being born female meant accepting a lifetime of artificial limitations. Tonight, as you get ready for sleep, I want you to think about Emma Watson walking onto the stage at the United Nations in 2014 to deliver her He for She speech about gender equality. As she stood there in her simple black dress, speaking with quiet confidence about women's rights, she was doing something that would have been absolutely impossible for a Victorian woman using her own voice, in her own words, to challenge the world's most powerful leaders about women's place in society. But here's what makes Emma's moment even more remarkable. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, every choice about how to present herself was still being filtered through the echoes of Victorian restrictions we've explored together tonight. The criticism she faced afterward about her appearance, her tone, whether she was too young or too privileged to speak on these issues, came directly from the same social mechanisms that once silenced women with dance cards and chaperones. The difference is that Emma had something Victorian women could only dream of: the choice to speak anyway. This is what I find most incredible about our journey through Victorian women's restrictions tonight. Every single bizarre rule we've explored, from hidden ankles to strategic fainting, from toxic beauty standards to forbidden conversations, was ultimately about one thing: controlling women's choices. Their specific methods changed over time, but the underlying goal remained the same: to convince women that their natural impulses, thoughts, and desires were somehow dangerous and needed to be managed by others. But here's the twist that would probably surprise those Victorian rulemakers. Their oppressive system accidentally created some of the most resourceful, intelligent, and strategically brilliant women in history. When you force people to communicate in code, they become master communicators. When you require them to navigate complex social systems, they develop extraordinary social intelligence. When you demand that they find subtle ways to resist, they become incredibly creative problem solvers. The Victorian women we've met tonight, the ones who turned fainting into communication tools, who created secret languages with fans, who conducted love affairs through apple preserve recipes, weren't victims. They were some of the most sophisticated resistance fighters who ever lived. They took every restriction placed on them and found ways to use it for their own purposes. Dr. Jera Lerner, the pioneering women's historian, spent decades studying how women have always found ways to exercise agency, even within the most restrictive systems. Her research revealed that women's resistance has been the quiet, persistent force driving social change throughout history. She wrote, "Women have never been passive victims of oppression. Even in the darkest periods of restriction, they found ways to create meaning, build relationships, and push against the boundaries that confined them." This pattern continues today in ways that would make those Victorian rebels proud. When modern dress codes try to control women's appearance, women find creative ways to express themselves within the restrictions. When workplace cultures discourage women from speaking directly, they develop influential communication strategies that get results. When social media creates new forms of surveillance and judgment, women build supportive communities that provide alternatives to mainstream approval. The Me Too movement is perhaps the most powerful example of this continuing resistance tradition. Women who had been silenced by fear, shame, and social pressure found ways to use modern communication tools to break their silence collectively. They turned social media, a platform that often amplifies judgment and restriction, into a tool for sharing truth and demanding accountability. Dr. Tana Burke, who founded the Me Too movement, has explicitly connected her work to the historical tradition of women's resistance. She said, "Every woman who speaks up today stands on the shoulders of countless women who found ways to resist in their own time with their own tools." We're not the first generation to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. We're just the first with these particular platforms. But perhaps the most important lesson from our Victorian journey is how these restrictions affected not just individual women, but entire societies. When you systematically waste half your population's intellectual, creative, and leadership potential, everyone suffers. The economic, scientific, and cultural progress that was lost because brilliant women were forced to hide their capabilities is incalculable. Modern research on gender equality consistently shows that societies with greater gender equality are more prosperous, more innovative, and more stable. Companies with women in leadership positions consistently outperform those without. Countries with higher female education and workforce participation have stronger economies and healthier populations. This isn't just about fairness, it's about effectiveness. The Victorian system of restricting women wasn't just cruel. It was also incredibly wasteful and counterproductive. Yet I don't want to end our journey tonight on a note of anger about past injustices. Instead, I'm filled with admiration for the extraordinary women who lived through these restrictions and found ways to create meaning, love, and progress, despite them all. Their stories remind us that human creativity and resilience can flourish even under the most challenging circumstances. Think about Mrs. Catherine Morrison, who we met earlier, developing those elaborate library meeting systems with her beloved Edward. Think about the literary ladies of Concord conducting graduate-level philosophical discussions disguised as needlework circles. Think about Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell revolutionizing medicine while convincing everyone she was just a lady with an unusual hobby. These women didn't wait for permission to live meaningful lives. They didn't wait for society to change before they started changing it themselves. They worked with what they had, used the tools available to them, and created possibilities that hadn't existed before. Their example offers profound lessons for anyone facing restrictions or limitations today. Whether those restrictions come from gender expectations, racial discrimination, economic constraints, family pressures, or personal circumstances, the Victorian women's strategies remain relevant. Find creative ways to work within the system while subtly undermining it. Build alliances with others facing similar challenges. Use society's own tools against its limitations. And never stop believing that change is possible. But most importantly, their stories remind us that individual acts of resistance, however small they might seem, contribute to larger transformations that can take generations to complete. Every Victorian woman who refused to faint on command, who wrote coded love letters, who spoke her mind despite social pressure, was participating in a movement that would eventually give women the vote, access to education, career opportunities, and legal rights that seemed impossible in their lifetimes. As you think about the women in your own life, your mothers, daughters, sisters, friends, colleagues, remember that they're all inheritors of this incredible legacy of resistance and resilience. Every freedom they enjoy, every opportunity they pursue, every choice they make about their own lives exists because countless women before them refuse to accept that this is just how things are. And if you're a woman listening to this story, remember that you're part of this continuing tradition. Every time you speak up for yourself, pursue your goals despite discouragement, or refuse to accept limitations that seem artificial or unfair, you're honoring the memory of those Victorian women who dreamed of exactly the freedoms you now possess. The restrictions they faced may seem absurd to us now, but they felt just as real and permanent to the women living under them as any limitations feel to us today. Their courage in challenging what seemed unchangeable should inspire us to question what we accept as unchangeable in our own time. The fight for genuine equality, not just legal equality, but the deeper cultural transformation that allows all people to live authentically and pursue their full potential, continues today. It's being waged in workplaces and classrooms, in families and communities, in legislatures and boardrooms, and in the daily choices that each of us makes about how to treat ourselves and others. So tonight, as you rest, carry with you the memory of those remarkable Victorian women who refused to be silenced, who found light in darkness, who created beauty despite restriction, and who never stopped believing that a better world was possible. Their courage lives on in every woman who refuses to be diminished, and their dreams have become our reality. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden world of Victorian women's etiquette. These stories of restriction and resistance, of suffering and strength, remind us that understanding our past is essential for creating our future. I hope these tales have given you new appreciation for the freedoms we sometimes take for granted and new inspiration for the challenges we still face. The women we've met tonight would be amazed by how far we've come, and they'd probably have some excellent strategic advice for how to keep moving forward. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you soon for our next journey into the fascinating, surprising, and often shocking stories that shape our world. Until then, remember, every restriction was made by humans, and every restriction can be changed by humans. The Victorian women proved that truth with their lives and their legacy lives on in all of us. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of this continuing story of human courage and transformation.